This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. My shift started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m., did my initial rounds, and settled into the security desk near the main entrance. The first few hours were uneventful. I alternated between checking the security cameras, browsing my phone, and fighting to stay awake. Around 2 a.m., I decided to do another walkthrough of the office. As I passed by the open workspace filled with rows of desks and monitors, I heard a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the building settling or the AC kicking on, but then I heard it again, a soft shuffling noise, like fabric brushing against carpet. My heart started racing. I pulled out my flashlight and swept it across the room. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I took a deep breath and started walking slowly between the rows of desks, shining my light into every corner and crevice. The office looked different at night. Shadows stretched across the floor, and the glow of standby lights on various devices created an eerie atmosphere. As I neared the back of the room, I heard the noise again, closer this time. It was definitely coming from under one of the desks. I crouched down, my hand shaking as I aimed the flashlight beam beneath the workspace. That's when I saw him. Crouched in the darkness was a man with wild, unkempt black hair. His face was gaunt, with deep dark circles under his eyes that made them look sunken and hollow. He was wearing what looked like a dirty white dress shirt and slacks, like he'd been wearing the same clothes for days. Our eyes met, and for a split second, we both froze. Then he bolted. The man scrambled out from under the desk with surprising speed. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as I tried to get out of his way. He darted past me, knocking over a chair in the process. "Hey, stop!" I yelled, fumbling for the radio at my belt. But by the time I got my bearings, he was already sprinting towards the stairwell. I chased after him, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear his footsteps echoing as he raced down the stairs. I followed, taking the steps two at a time, but he had too much of a head start. By the time I burst out of the stairwell into the lobby, there was no sign of him. I ran to the front doors, but they were still locked and secured. How did he get out? Panting and confused, I did a quick sweep of the lobby. Nothing seemed disturbed. I went back upstairs to check the office again, but found no trace of the intruder besides the overturned chair. With shaking hands, I called the police and my supervisor. While I waited for them to arrive, I reviewed the security camera footage. To my shock, there was nothing. No sign of the man entering the building, hiding under the desk, or fleeing. It was as if he had simply appeared and disappeared into thin air. When the police arrived, they did a thorough search of the building, but found no evidence of a break-in. No fingerprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing. They took my statement, but I could tell they were skeptical. Hell, I was starting to doubt myself. My supervisor arrived shortly after, looking concerned and a bit annoyed at being woken up in the middle of the night. He questioned me about what happened, then insisted on reviewing the security footage himself. When he saw that there was no visual evidence of an intruder, his expression changed from concern to suspicion. "Are you sure you saw someone?" he asked, his tone implying he thought I might have dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. I insisted that I knew what I saw, but with each retelling, my certainty wavered. Had I imagined it? Was I more tired than I realized? The rest of my shift passed in a blur of police questions, paperwork, and confused co-workers arriving for the early morning shift. By the time I left at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and doubting my own sanity. The next few days were rough. I couldn't shake the image of that man's hollow eyes staring back at me from under the desk. I had trouble sleeping, jumping at every little noise in my apartment. When I returned to work, I felt on edge the entire time, constantly looking over my shoulder and checking under desks. My coworkers were supportive at first, but as days passed with no further incidents, I could sense their skepticism growing. Whispers and sidelong glances followed me around the office. I overheard someone in the break room joking about the ghost in the machine. But the worst part was the nagging feeling that there was more to this story than met the eye. Why was that man in our office? What was he looking for? And how did he manage to evade all our security measures? I started paying closer attention to the goings-on at Technova. Were there secrets hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary startup? I noticed my supervisor having hushed conversations with the CEO, both of them looking worried. There were rumors of a big project in the works, something that could change everything, according to the excited whispers of the dev team. A week after the incident, I was called into a meeting with HR and my supervisor. They expressed concern about my recent behavior and suggested I take some time off to recover from the stress of the incident. It felt like a polite way of saying they thought I was losing it. I tried to argue, to make them understand that what I saw was real, but the more I talked, the more I sounded like a conspiracy theorist. In the end, I agreed to take a week of paid leave, hoping some time away would help clear my head. But even as I write this from the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the feeling that something is very wrong. The image of that man, his wild hair, his sunken eyes, the desperation in his expression, haunts me. Was he a corporate spy, a disgruntled ex-employee, or something else entirely? I don't know if I'll ever get answers. Part of me wants to quit, to put this whole experience behind me and find a nice, boring day job. But another part of me needs to know the truth. What really happened that night? What secrets is Technova hiding? All I know for sure is that my perception of reality has been shaken to its core. The line between what's real and what's imagined feels blurrier than ever. And every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow, desperate eyes staring back at me from the darkness under the desk. I don't know what to do next. I don't know who to trust. All I know is that the world feels a lot scarier and more mysterious than it did before that night. And I have a sinking feeling that this is only the beginning of something much bigger and more terrifying than I could ever imagine. I was doing a favor for my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, by house-sitting for her while she visited her daughter for the weekend. It was supposed to be an easy gig, just water the plants, feed the cat, and keep an eye on things. Her house was on a quiet cul-de-sac in our suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. The first night started off uneventfully enough. I settled in on the couch to watch some TV after dinner, absent-mindedly petting Mrs. Thompson's fluffy orange tabby Marmalade. Around 10 p.m. I heard a sharp knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I figured maybe it was another neighbor checking in. I opened the door, but there was no one there. Just the empty porch and the quiet street beyond. Weird, I thought, but shrugged it off. Probably just some kids playing ding-dong ditch or something. I had just sat back down when there was another knock, this time at the back door. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this didn't feel right. I cautiously made my way to the kitchen and peered out the window, but again, there was no one there. My heart was starting to race a bit. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. As I made my way back to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to focus on the TV, but I kept glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in. About 20 minutes passed without incident. I was starting to relax a little when suddenly there were 3 loud, insistent knocks at the front door again. I jumped, my pulse pounding. This time I didn't want to open it. I crept quietly to the peephole and looked out, but saw nothing but the empty porch. "Hello?" I called out shakily. No response. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Should I call the police? But what would I even say? Someone's knocking on the doors, but no one's there. They'd probably think I was crazy or pulling a prank. I decided to text my friend Jake, who lived nearby, just to have someone know what was happening. As I was typing out the message, there was a series of rapid knocks at the back door, so forceful it made me drop my phone. Panic was really setting in now. I snatched up my phone and raced upstairs to the guest bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to finish the text to Jake. Just as I hit send, the power cut out, plunging the house into darkness. I stifled a scream, fumbling for my phone's flashlight. The beam of light did little to dispel the oppressive blackness. In the silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. Then, from downstairs, more knocking. Front door, back door, side door. A frenzied percussion that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I huddled in the corner of the room, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream or some kind of sick prank. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. I strained my ears, trying to detect any sound of movement in the house. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Suddenly, my phone lit up with a text from Jake. "On my way. You okay?" I breathed a sigh of relief. Jake would be here soon. Everything would be all right. I started to type a response when I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the front door lock. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Thompson and her daughter were the only other people with keys, and they were hundreds of miles away. Whoever, or whatever, had been knocking was now inside the house. I heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Closer and closer they came. I pressed myself against the wall, willing myself to disappear. The doorknob to the guest room began to turn slowly. In that moment, survival instinct kicked in. I bolted for the window, wrenching it open and practically diving onto the sloped roof of the porch below. I scrambled down, scraping my hands and knees, and hit the ground running. I sprinted down the street in bare feet, not daring to look back. As I rounded the corner, I nearly collided with Jake's car. He slammed on the brakes, eyes wide with shock. "Get in!" he yelled, and I didn't need to be told twice. I dove into the passenger seat, gasping for air. "Go, go, go!" I urged, and Jake floored it. As we sped away, I finally chanced to glance back at Mrs. Thompson's house. What I saw made my blood run cold. A tall, dark figure stood on the front lawn, motionless. As we turned the corner, I could have sworn I saw it raise a hand, as if waving goodbye. Jake drove me back to my place, and I spent the rest of the night recounting the terrifying experience to him and the police. They searched Mrs. Thompson's house, but found no signs of forced entry or any intruders. The power was working fine, and nothing seemed out of place. I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, some kind of stress-induced hallucination or waking nightmare. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Mrs. Thompson returned home without incident, and nothing strange ever occurred there again. But I still get chills every time I drive past that house, and sometimes late at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of knocking at my door. Emily, it called softly. My blood ran cold. I lived alone in my small apartment. There shouldn't be anyone else here, let alone someone who knew my name. I lay frozen in bed, straining my ears. Had I imagined it? Just as I was starting to convince myself it was a dream, I heard it again. Emily. The whisper was slightly louder this time, unmistakable. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? Was this some kind of sick prank? I reached for my phone on the nightstand with trembling hands, ready to call 911. But a small part of me was curious. The voice didn't sound menacing, just odd, eerily calm and emotionless. Against my better judgment, I slowly got out of bed. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I crept towards the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening intently. Nothing but silence now. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I had to know what was out there. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty and dark. I flicked on the light switch, illuminating the small living room beyond. Nothing seemed out of place. I checked the front door, still locked. The windows were all closed too. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. I was starting to feel silly. Had I dreamed the whole thing? I was about to head back to bed when there was a knock at my front door that made me jump. "Emily, are you okay in there?" It was my neighbor from across the hall, Lisa. I opened the door, confused. "Lisa? What are you doing up?" She looked as bewildered as I felt. I heard someone calling your name. It woke me up. I thought maybe something was wrong, so I came to check. A chill ran down my spine, so I hadn't imagined it after all. "You heard it too? From where?" "It sounded like it was coming from out in the hallway," Lisa said. "But when I looked, there was no one there." We stared at each other, both unsettled. "Do you want to come in?" I asked. "Maybe we can figure this out." Lisa nodded and stepped inside. We searched my small apartment together, checking every corner and crevice. But there was no sign of an intruder or anything out of the ordinary. "This is so weird," I said, collapsing onto my couch. "I don't understand where that voice could have come from." "Me neither," Lisa agreed. "And how did it know your name?" We tossed around theories. Maybe it was someone playing a prank in the building, or the wind making strange noises. But deep down, we both knew those explanations didn't quite fit. Lisa stayed for a while, neither of us eager to be alone after the unsettling experience. We made some tea and tried to distract ourselves with small talk, but the nervous energy never fully dissipated. Around 3 a.m., Lisa decided to head back to her place. "Try to get some sleep," she said. "I'm sure there's a logical explanation for all this." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. After she left, I double and triple checked all the locks. I even pushed my heavy bookshelf in front of the front door, just in case. Sleep was out of the question now. I curled up on the couch with all the lights on, jumping at every little noise. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, my eyes grew heavy despite my anxiety. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again. That same whisper, right next to my ear. "Emily." I bolted upright with a scream, my heart nearly beating out of my chest. But the apartment was still empty. No one was there. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and keys and ran out of the apartment, not even bothering to change out of my pajamas. I banged on Lisa's door frantically. She opened it, looking groggy and confused. "Emily, what's wrong?" "I heard it again," I said, my voice shaking. "Can I please stay here for a while? I can't be in my apartment right now." Lisa's eyes widened, but she nodded and ushered me inside. We spent the rest of the morning huddled on her couch, jumping at every noise. When the building manager arrived at 9 a.m., we practically ambushed him in the lobby. He listened to our story with a skeptical expression. "I've never heard of anything like that happening here before," he said, "but I'll take a look around, check the security cameras." We waited anxiously as he reviewed the footage, but the cameras showed nothing unusual. No strangers entering the building, no one lurking in the hallways. The manager did a walkthrough of my apartment but found nothing out of place. "I'm sorry, ladies, but I'm not sure what to tell you," he said. "There's no evidence of any intruder or anything strange going on. Maybe it was just a dream that seemed very real." But Lisa and I knew what we'd heard. We spent the next few days on edge, hardly sleeping. I stayed with Lisa, too scared to return to my own apartment. We left lights on constantly and jumped at every little noise. After a week with no further incidents, I finally worked up the courage to move back into my place. But things never quite felt the same. I always had the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I never heard the whisper again after that night. Lisa and I still talk about it sometimes, trying to make sense of what happened. But we've never been able to come up with a satisfactory explanation. To this day, I sleep with a nightlight on and music playing softly to drown out any potential whispers. I've thought about moving, but part of me is afraid the voice might follow me wherever I go. Sometimes I wonder if I'm slowly losing my mind. But then I remember, Lisa heard it too. Whatever that voice was, wherever it came from, it was real. And that's what scares me most of all. I've searched online for similar experiences, posted on forums looking for answers. But nothing quite matches what Lisa and I went through that night. It's like the whisper came out of nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously, leaving us with nothing but lingering fear and unanswered questions. I find myself analyzing every little sound now, always on alert for that whisper. It's exhausting living this way, constantly on edge. But I don't know how else to be. How do you ever feel safe again after something like that? I've considered seeing a therapist, but I'm worried they'll just tell me it was all in my head, that maybe Lisa and I somehow shared some kind of mass hysteria. But it felt so real, so present in that moment. The rational part of my brain tries to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a neighbor playing a cruel prank, or some kind of weird acoustics in the building that carried sound in an odd way. But none of those explanations feel quite right. And then there's the question that keeps me up at night. Why me? Why my name? What if it happens again? What if next time there's more than just a whisper? I know I need to find a way to move past this, to reclaim my sense of safety and peace. But for now, that whisper echoes in my mind, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we may never fully understand. So I remain vigilant, always listening, always watching. Because if it happened once, it could happen again. And next time, I want to be ready. I was exhausted after putting my 6-month-old son Tommy down for his nap. Being a single mom is tough, and I cherish those quiet moments when he's asleep. I collapsed onto the couch, looking forward to a bit of peace and quiet. That's when I heard it, a faint crying sound coming from the baby monitor. My heart sank. Tommy had just fallen asleep, and I was desperate for a break. Sighing, I hauled myself off the couch and trudged up the stairs to check on him. But when I peeked into his room, Tommy was sound asleep in his crib, peaceful as could be. Confused, I turned up the volume on the monitor. The crying continued, but it wasn't coming from Tommy. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sound was only coming through the monitor itself. I chalked it up to interference and tried to brush it off. But as I headed back downstairs, the crying grew louder and more distressed. It sounded like a baby in pain or terror. My hands shook as I fiddled with the monitor, trying to shut it off, but nothing worked. The wailing continued, filling the house. Panicked, I ran back up to Tommy's room. He was still fast asleep, oblivious to the awful sounds. I scooped him up and held him close, my heart pounding. The cries from the monitor reached a fever pitch, and I swear I felt a cold presence brush past me. I fled downstairs with Tommy, my mind racing. Was our house haunted? Was I hallucinating from sleep deprivation? I tried to reason with myself. There had to be a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. For the next few hours, I paced anxiously around the living room with Tommy in my arms, unable to settle. The crying would stop for a while, lulling me into a false sense of security. But just as I started to relax, it would start up again, more anguished than before. I called my mom in tears, but she assumed I was just overwhelmed and told me to get some rest. I was too afraid to tell her what was really happening. She'd think I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. As evening fell, the atmosphere in the house grew heavy and oppressive. The air felt thick, making it hard to breathe. Shadows in the corners seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I kept all the lights on, but it did little to dispel the darkness that seemed to be closing in around us. Tommy started to get fussy, picking up on my fear and tension. I tried to soothe him, forcing myself to sing lullabies in a shaky voice. But the cries from the monitor drowned out my attempts, growing more frantic and desperate. In a moment of determination, I decided to face whatever this was head-on. Clutching Tommy tightly, I marched up to his room where the monitor was. The crying reached a crescendo as I approached. My hand trembled as I reached for the monitor. Just as my fingers brushed it, the crying abruptly cut off. The silence was deafening. Then I heard a chilling whisper through the static. "He's mine." I screamed and stumbled backwards, nearly dropping Tommy. The lights in the room flickered wildly. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath in the air. The whisper came again, closer this time, as if someone was standing right behind me. "Give him to me." Blind with terror, I ran from the room and down the stairs, holding Tommy so tightly he started to cry. I fumbled with my keys and burst out of the front door into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my lungs burning. With shaking hands, I strapped Tommy into his car seat and peeled out of the driveway. I had no destination in mind. I just knew I had to get as far away from that house as possible. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly crashed the car. For a split second, I swore I saw a dark, shadowy figure in the back seat next to Tommy. I drove for hours, too afraid to stop. Tommy eventually fell asleep, but I remained on high alert, my eyes darting to every shadow and movement. I ended up at my mom's house 2 states away, showing up on her doorstep at 3 a.m., a hysterical mess. To her credit, my mom didn't ask questions. She just hugged me tightly and got Tommy and me settled in the guest room. I didn't sleep a wink that night, jumping at every little sound. But nothing happened. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, and the only sounds from the baby monitor were Tommy's soft breaths. I never went back to that house. I had friends pack up my belongings and sold it as quickly as possible. I couldn't bear the thought of another family, another baby, experiencing what we did. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I hear that ghostly crying. I keep Tommy close, terrified that whatever was in that house might still be searching for him. I don't know what happened that day. Was it a ghost, a demon, or just my sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on me? All I know is that the terror I felt was real, and I'll never forget the evil that tried to take my son. I hold him a little tighter now, grateful for every moment we have together. But a part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for that chilling whisper to return. We arrived at the farmhouse late Friday afternoon. It was a charming two-story house that had been in Megan's family for generations, situated on a large plot of land surrounded by fields and forest. As we unpacked the car and settled in, I felt the tension start to melt away. The air was crisp and clean, birds were chirping, and the sunset painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. After a simple dinner of pasta and wine, we cuddled up on the couch to watch a movie. It was so quiet compared to our apartment in the city. No traffic noise, no sirens, just the occasional creak of the old house settling. Around 11 p.m. we decided to head to bed. As I was brushing my teeth, I thought I heard a faint thump coming from somewhere in the house. I paused, straining my ears, but didn't hear anything else. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the unfamiliar noises of an old house. A couple hours later, I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. It took me a moment to remember where I was. The bedroom was pitch black and eerily silent. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized what had woken me. There was a distinct scratching sound coming from somewhere below us. I gently shook Megan awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment, then nodded, her eyes wide. "It sounds like it's coming from the basement," she said softly. We lay there frozen, barely breathing as we listened intently. The scratching continued intermittently, sometimes stopping for a few seconds before starting up again. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, almost like someone was dragging something across the floor. "Maybe it's just mice," Megan suggested hopefully, but I could hear the fear in her voice. I swallowed hard. "I'll go check it out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and crept down the hallway towards the basement door, Megan following close behind me. As we approached, my blood ran cold. The basement door was slightly ajar, even though I distinctly remembered Megan locking it earlier. With trembling hands, I slowly pushed the door open wider. The beam of my phone's flashlight illuminated the top of the rickety wooden stairs, leading down into inky blackness. The scratching had stopped, but now I could hear something else, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving around in the basement below. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door shut and run, but a morbid curiosity compelled me forward. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone down there?" The footsteps abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. "We should call the police," Megan whispered urgently, tugging at my arm. I nodded in agreement, but before I could reach for my phone, the footsteps started up again, and they were coming towards the stairs. Panic exploded in my chest. I slammed the basement door shut and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. As soon as it was locked, we sprinted back to the bedroom and barricaded ourselves inside, shoving a heavy dresser in front of the door. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911 and quickly explained the situation. The dispatcher said they would send officers right away, but it would take at least 20 minutes for them to reach our remote location. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. We huddled together on the bed, jumping at every little sound. I kept expecting to hear someone trying to break down the door, but the house remained quiet. After what felt like hours, we heard a car pulling up outside. I cautiously peeked out the window and saw the flashing lights of a police cruiser. Relief washed over me. 2 officers searched the entire house and property, but found no signs of an intruder. The basement door was still locked when they checked it. They were sympathetic but clearly skeptical, probably assuming we were just a jumpy couple spooked by normal house noises. They said they'd do an extra patrol of the area that night and left us with the non-emergency number to call if we needed anything else. After they left, Megan and I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, to get as far away from that house as possible. But it was the middle of the night. We were both exhausted, and the rational part of my brain was trying to convince me that it had all been our imagination. In the end, we decided to stay the night, but sleep in the living room with all the lights on. Neither of us slept much. Every creaking floorboard or rustling leaf outside made us tense up. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I felt myself finally starting to relax. We had made it through the night. Nothing had happened. Maybe it really had all been in our heads. But then Megan grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Look," she whispered, pointing towards the basement door. My stomach dropped. The door was open again, just a crack. We didn't bother packing up our things. We grabbed our phones and car keys and got the hell out of there, driving straight back to the city. We've never gone back to that farmhouse, and Megan's family ended up selling it a few months later. To this day, I still can't explain what happened that night. Was there really someone, or something, in that basement? Or did our minds play an incredibly vivid trick on us? All I know is that the memory of those footsteps coming up the basement stairs still haunts my nightmares. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was an animal that somehow got in. Maybe the old house was just making strange noises that our frightened minds misinterpreted. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that there was something truly sinister in that basement. Something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted us to know it was there. Sometimes I wonder if the new owners of that farmhouse have experienced anything similar. Part of me wants to reach out and ask, but a bigger part of me is afraid of what I might learn. So I try to push the memory away and tell myself it was all just a bizarre, frightening coincidence. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I still find myself straining to listen for those phantom footsteps. I was exhausted after a long day at work and just wanted to get home to my apartment and relax. As I entered the elevator in my building's lobby, I felt a sense of relief, knowing I'd soon be able to unwind. I pressed the button for the 7th floor and leaned against the wall, closing my eyes for a moment. When I opened them again, I froze. In the reflection of the mirrored wall opposite me, I saw a dark, shadowy figure standing right behind me. My heart started racing as I spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty space. I blinked hard, convincing myself I must have imagined it in my tired state. But as I turned back to face the doors, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The elevator seemed to crawl upwards at an agonizingly slow pace. I kept glancing nervously at the mirrored walls, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again. But there was nothing, just my own pale, anxious face staring back at me. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. I felt like there were eyes boring into me from behind. When the doors finally opened on my floor, I practically bolted out. I speed-walked down the hallway to my apartment, fumbling with my keys as I approached the door. As I inserted the key into the lock, I could have sworn I heard soft footsteps behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but the hallway was completely empty. I quickly let myself in and slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself. "There's nothing there. You're just tired and imagining things." But even as I tried to reassure myself, that creeping sense of dread wouldn't leave me. I did a quick scan of my apartment. Everything looked normal. No signs of any intruders or anything out of place. I told myself to relax and tried to go about my usual evening routine. I heated up some leftover pasta for dinner and settled onto the couch to watch TV. But I couldn't focus on the show. My eyes kept darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. Was that dark patch by the bookshelf always there? Did something just move in my peripheral vision? I got up and paced around the apartment, double-checking that all the windows and doors were securely locked. As I passed by the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror and nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was just my own reflection. My face looked pale and drawn, with dark circles under my eyes. "Get a grip," I told my reflection sternly. But even as I said it, I saw a flicker of something dark pass behind me in the mirror. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway. My heart was racing now. I knew logically that I was alone in my locked apartment, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched, followed, stalked by some unseen presence. I tried to distract myself by taking a hot shower, hoping it would help me relax. But as I stood under the spray of water, I kept imagining the shower curtain suddenly being ripped open. Every slight sound, the pipes creaking, water dripping, made me flinch. After my shower, I quickly dried off and got dressed, not wanting to be vulnerable and exposed for long. I decided to make some chamomile tea, thinking it might calm my nerves. As the kettle heated up, I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes, taking deep breaths. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud from my bedroom. My eyes flew open, and I froze in place, hardly daring to breathe. Had I really heard that, or was my mind playing tricks on me? After a few moments of tense silence, I forced myself to go investigate. I crept towards my bedroom, every muscle tense. As I approached the partially open door, I could have sworn I saw a shadow move across the sliver of visible room. My hand shook as I reached out to push the door open wider. The room was empty. Everything looked untouched, but my eyes were drawn to the closet door, which was now slightly ajar. I was certain I'd left it firmly closed earlier. I approached the closet slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. With a trembling hand, I grasped the doorknob. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, then yanked the door open. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly and some boxes stacked on the floor. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling silly for getting so worked up. But as I started to close the door, I noticed something odd. One of the boxes had been moved slightly, leaving a gap that wasn't there before. I knelt down to examine it closer. That's when I saw it, a tuft of dark hair sticking out from behind the box. My blood ran cold. With shaking hands, I slowly pushed the box aside. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain that tuft of hair I'd seen. I sat back on my heels, my mind reeling. Was I going crazy, hallucinating, or was there really something sinister going on? I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, unable to relax or sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. I must have checked and rechecked the locks a dozen times. At one point, I could have sworn I heard breathing coming from right behind me, but when I whirled around, there was nothing there, just empty air. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. As dawn finally began to break, I was completely exhausted, but still too wired and paranoid to sleep. I hadn't seen any more concrete evidence of an intruder, but I couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty that I wasn't alone, that some unseen presence had been stalking me all night. Even now, days later, I'm still on edge. I've had my locks changed and installed a security system, but it hasn't helped much. I'm barely sleeping, constantly looking over my shoulder and checking dark corners. I know how crazy this all sounds. Trust me, I've questioned my own sanity more times than I can count over the past few days. But I know what I experienced. That shadowy figure in the elevator mirror, the footsteps in the hall, the moved box and tuft of hair in my closet, the constant, oppressive feeling of being watched. I don't know if it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely, but I'm certain that something was in my apartment that night. Something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted me to know it was there, and I'm terrified that it might come back. I haven't told anyone else about this. Who would believe me? But I had to get it off my chest somehow. Writing it all out has helped a little, but I'm still struggling to make sense of it. I just hope that by sharing my experience, maybe someone out there who's gone through something similar will know they're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, someone will have an explanation for what happened to me that night. For now, all I can do is try to move forward and hope that whatever was stalking me that night doesn't return. But I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe in my own home again. The fear and uncertainty linger, like a shadow I can't quite shake. All I know for sure is that I'll never look at my reflection in an elevator mirror the same way again. The cabin was even more isolated than I'd imagined. Surrounded by dense forest on all sides, the narrow dirt driveway seemed to stretch on forever before I finally saw the flickering porch light in the distance. A chill ran down my spine as I pulled up, but I chalked it up to first-day jitters and the eerie atmosphere. Mrs. Johnson, my patient, was a frail woman in her 80s, recovering from hip surgery. She greeted me warmly and showed me to the guest room where I'd be staying. After getting her settled for the night, I tried to relax, but something felt off. Maybe it was the creaking of the old wooden floors, or the way the wind whistled through the trees outside. I kept feeling like I was being watched, even though we were miles from civilization. I tossed and turned for hours before finally drifting off into a restless sleep. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, a loud crash of thunder jolted me awake. Rain was pounding against the windows as lightning illuminated the room in brief flashes. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, movement outside the window caught my attention. I froze, heart pounding, as a pale face slowly came into view. Blank eyes stared directly at me, unblinking. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain I must be dreaming. When I opened them again, the face was gone. Shaking, I got up to check on Mrs. Johnson, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. She was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm raging outside. I decided to make some tea to calm my nerves. As I stood in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, I heard it. A soft tapping sound, barely audible over the rain. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the living room window. My mouth went dry as I crept towards the sound, straining my eyes to see through the rain-streaked glass. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a flash of lightning illuminated a face pressed against the window, inches away from me. I stumbled backwards with a strangled scream, knocking over a chair in my panic. By the time I looked again, it was gone. This couldn't be happening. I was letting my imagination run wild, that's all. I took a few deep breaths, trying to collect myself. The tapping started again, more insistent this time. Tap, 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 tap. "Hello," I called out, hating how my voice shook. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then the tapping resumed, moving from window to window around the cabin. I ran to check the doors, locked tight. Mrs. Johnson was still fast asleep, undisturbed by the commotion. I grabbed my phone, intending to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, We were in the middle of nowhere. The tapping grew louder, turning into pounding. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I had to do something. Grabbing an umbrella for protection, I stepped out onto the porch. Rain immediately soaked through my clothes as I peered into the darkness, umbrella raised like a weapon. "Who's there?" I shouted. "I'm calling the police." Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the yard. There was no one there, but as the thunder faded, I heard rustling in the trees at the edge of the property. Something was moving out there, circling the cabin. I sprinted back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. What the hell was going on? I considered waking Mrs. Johnson, but what could she do? She could barely walk. The pounding resumed, so loud it seemed to shake the whole cabin. I cowered in the corner of the living room, watching in horror as the door rattled in its frame. It was going to break down any second. Then, as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. An oppressive silence fell over the cabin, broken only by my ragged breathing and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Minutes ticked by. I stayed frozen in place, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. Nothing. Maybe whatever it was had given up and left. Slowly, I crept towards the window, dreading what I might see, but needing to know if the coast was clear. I pulled back the curtain just a crack and peered out. Two pale, sunken eyes stared back at me. I screamed and stumbled backwards, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. By the time I scrambled to my feet, the face was gone again. But now I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something was out there, stalking us. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. We were trapped here, miles from help, with some kind of creature circling the cabin. I had no weapons, no way to call for help. We were sitting ducks. A new sound caught my attention, a slow, methodical scratching. It was coming from the bedroom where Mrs. Johnson slept. Oh, God. I grabbed a fireplace poker and crept towards the bedroom, heart in my throat. The scratching grew louder as I approached. With shaking hands, I slowly pushed open the door. Mrs. Johnson's bed was empty. I spun around, searching the shadows of the room in panic. Where was she? The scratching sound was coming from above me. I looked up just as a shape detached itself from the ceiling and dropped towards me. I caught a glimpse of twisted limbs and that horrifying pale face before I turned and ran. I burst out of the cabin into the pouring rain, not bothering to grab my keys or phone. Pure terror propelled me down the muddy driveway and into the woods. Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly through the trees, the sound of inhuman shrieking urging me on. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, maybe. The storm raged on as I stumbled through the forest, soaked to the bone and scratched all over. Several times I slipped and fell in the mud, but the memory of that face spurred me back to my feet. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights in the distance. Civilization. I staggered into a gas station parking lot just as dawn was breaking, collapsing to my knees in exhaustion and relief. The staff called an ambulance and the police. I babbled my story to the officers, fully aware of how crazy it sounded. They sent units to the cabin, but found no sign of Mrs. Johnson or any intruder. The place was deserted. I spent a week in the hospital recovering from exposure and exhaustion. The police questioned me extensively, clearly suspecting I'd done something to my patient. But they could find no evidence of foul play, and eventually closed the case as a missing persons. It's been months now, and I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, certain I can hear tapping at my window. I've replayed that night over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. Was it all a hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? Some kind of elaborate hoax? Or was there really something inhuman out there in those woods? I don't know if I'll ever have answers, But one thing's for certain. You couldn't pay me enough to ever set foot in that cabin again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I was employed as the caretaker for Thornhill Manor, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The pay was decent and the work wasn't too demanding, mostly just basic upkeep and making sure everything was in order for when the owners visited a few times a year. I'd been there about 6 months and had settled into a comfortable routine. That all changed one autumn night. I was doing my usual evening rounds, checking that all the doors and windows were secure before turning in. As I walked down the long hallway on the second floor, I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the floor above. I froze, listening intently. The steps were slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the corridor to the other. My heart started racing. I knew I was completely alone in the house. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. I told myself it must be the old house settling, or maybe a raccoon had gotten in somehow. But deep down, I knew those footsteps sounded far too heavy to be an animal. I hurried to finish my rounds, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Just as I was about to head to my room in the servants' quarters, I heard a door slam forcefully upstairs. I nearly jumped out of my skin. There was no mistaking that sound. It wasn't the wind or my imagination. Something or someone was up there. With shaking hands, I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made my way up the grand staircase. The third floor was rarely used and most of the rooms remained locked. As I reached the landing, my flashlight beam fell on something that made my blood run cold. One of the doors at the end of the hall was standing wide open. I approached cautiously, ears straining for any sound. As I got closer, I noticed a faint glow coming from inside the room. It wasn't the harsh glare of a light bulb, but a soft, ethereal illumination. My curiosity finally overcame my fear, and I peered around the doorframe. The room appeared to be an old study or library. Dusty bookshelves lined the walls, and a massive oak desk dominated the center of the space. But what drew my attention was a shimmering, translucent light hovering near the far corner. It pulsed gently, almost like it was breathing. As I stared transfixed, I became aware of a heavy, oppressive feeling settling over me. The air felt thick and charged with an unseen energy. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I found myself taking a step into the room, then another. It was as if some unseen force was pulling me forward against my will. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Not just watched, but scrutinized, observed. I could practically feel unseen eyes crawling over my skin. My breath caught in my throat as panic started to set in. I wanted desperately to flee, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The glow began to intensify, growing brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, everything stopped. The light winked out, and the oppressive feeling vanished in an instant. I was left standing alone in a pitch-black room, my ragged breathing the only sound. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, practically falling down the stairs in my desperation to get out. I didn't stop until I was in my car, tires squealing as I peeled out of the driveway. I drove aimlessly for hours, too terrified to go back, but with nowhere else to go. As the first rays of dawn began to appear, I finally pulled over at a rest stop to try and collect myself. My hands were still shaking as I replayed the events over and over. What the hell had happened in that room? What was that light, that presence I felt? I knew there was no way I could go back to Thornhill Manor. Whatever was in that house, I wanted no part of it. I called the owners that morning and quit on the spot, making up some family emergency. They seemed confused but didn't press me for details. It's been 2 years since that night, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've never experienced anything like that oppressive, observing presence. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if the isolation of the job had gotten to me somehow. But then I remember the sound of those footsteps, that unearthly glow, and I know it was all too real. I drive by Thornhill Manor occasionally, usually by accident when I take a wrong turn. The house looms on the hillside, windows dark and empty. But sometimes, just for a moment, I swear I see a faint light coming from that third-floor room. I always speed up and get as far away as I can. Whatever is in that house, I hope it stays there. And I hope whoever takes my place as caretaker is prepared for what they might encounter in the night. I still have nightmares about that room sometimes. In my dreams, I'm not able to escape. The unseen force pulls me further in as the light grows brighter and brighter. I always wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. Even now, years later, a part of me wonders if I truly got away that night, or if some piece of me is still there in that room, trapped with whatever inhabits Thornhill Manor. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe there was a gas leak causing hallucinations, or some kind of electrical phenomenon creating the light and strange sensations. But deep down, I know those are just comforting lies I tell myself. The truth is far more terrifying, that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, forces we can't explain or control. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But sometimes when I'm with friends and we're trading spooky stories, I'll share a sanitized version. I always downplay it, laugh it off as just my overactive imagination. But inside, I'm reliving every terrifying moment. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I find myself avoiding old buildings now, especially at night. The thought of being alone in a big empty house fills me with a nameless dread. I keep all the lights on in my apartment and triple-check the locks before bed. But it's not just fear that lingers. There's a sort of hyper-awareness that I can't shake, like my senses are constantly on high alert for anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes I catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turn to look. Other times I get an overwhelming feeling of being watched when I'm completely alone. I've done some research into the history of Thornhill Manor, trying to find any clues about what I encountered. The house has stood for over 150 years and changed hands many times. There are vague stories of tragedy and misfortune befalling various owners, but nothing concrete. No one else seems to have reported any paranormal activity there. Part of me wants to go back, to face whatever is in that room and get some answers. But the memory of that oppressive presence, that feeling of being inexorably drawn in against my will, is enough to keep me far away. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I often wonder about the current caretaker of Thornhill Manor. Have they experienced anything similar? Or is the house lying dormant, waiting for the right person to awaken whatever dwells within its walls? I'm tempted to reach out, to warn them. But what would I even say? So I keep my experience to myself, trying my best to move on with my life. But I know I'll never forget that night. The sound of phantom footsteps, the slamming door, and that pulsing, otherworldly light. Whatever was in that room, whatever gazed upon me with such intensity, has left an indelible mark on my soul. Thornhill Manor may look like just another old house from the outside, but I know the truth, that behind its stately facade lies something ancient and powerful, something that defies explanation. And on quiet nights when the wind whispers through bare trees, I can almost hear it calling to me, trying to lure me back into its shadowy embrace. As I approached my door, fumbling for my keys, something caught my eye. In the dim hallway light, I noticed faint scratches around the lock. My cop instincts immediately kicked in, overriding my fatigue. Someone had tried to break in. My heart started racing as I silently drew my service weapon. Taking a deep breath, I inserted my key as quietly as possible, turned it slowly, then burst through the door, gun raised. "Police! Don't move!" I shouted, quickly scanning the darkened apartment. But there was no one there, just silence and shadows. I flicked on the lights and did a thorough sweep of every room, checking closets, under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. No sign of forced entry beyond those scratches on the door. Logically, I knew the would-be intruder was long gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of vulnerability. This was my home, my sanctuary, after dealing with the worst of humanity all day, and now that sanctuary had been breached. I pulled out my phone to call it in, but hesitated. What exactly would I report? Some scratches that may or may not be new. No actual break-in. My colleagues were already spread thin with the ongoing burglary spree. I didn't want to pull resources away for what was likely nothing, so instead, I tried to put it out of my mind. I'm a cop, for Christ's sake. I deal with much worse than this on a daily basis. But as I went through my usual nightly routine, reheating leftovers, watching some mindless TV, I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the windows, the dark corners of the room. Every tiny creak or thump from neighboring apartments made me tense up. I didn't even realize how tightly I was gripping my gun until I went to set it on the nightstand. My knuckles were white from the death grip I'd maintained. Forcing myself to take some deep breaths, I placed the weapon within easy reach and crawled into bed. Sleep proved elusive. I tossed and turned, hyper-aware of every sound. The hum of the refrigerator, cars passing on the street below. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway, but when I crept to the door to peer through the peephole, there was no one there. I must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake in a cold sweat. Sunlight was streaming through the blinds. I'd slept through my alarm, but that wasn't what had startled me. There, on my bedroom door, was a handprint, a single, dusty handprint at about shoulder height. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my gun. "This is Officer Matthews. I have a 1031 at my residence," I barked into my radio, giving my address. As I waited for backup to arrive, I did another sweep of the apartment. Still no signs of intrusion, no other mysterious marks or evidence. Just that one handprint, accusingly visible in the morning light. When my fellow officers arrived, they dusted for prints and took photos, but ultimately there wasn't much to go on. The handprint was smudged, impossible to get usable fingerprints from, and given the scratches were on the outside of the door, there was no way to prove someone had actually been inside. "Look, Jake, you've been working yourself to the bone lately," my partner said gently. "Maybe you just didn't notice the handprint before, or sleepwalked and left it yourself?" I wanted to believe him. It was certainly more plausible than someone breaking in just to leave a cryptic handprint and nothing else. But deep down, I knew. Someone had been in my home while I slept. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I installed new locks, a security system, motion detector lights, but none of it helped me feel safe. I started sleeping on the couch, gun in hand, facing the door. Every shadow became a potential threat. The neighbor's cat yowling in the middle of the night sent me into a panic. I was jumpier on patrol, my hand constantly hovering near my weapon. My colleagues noticed the change. I overheard whispers, concerns about my mental state. But how could I explain? I'm a cop. I'm supposed to be the one who makes others feel safe. Admitting how terrified I was in my own home felt like failure. A week after the incident, I was heading home after another long shift. As I approached my building, movement caught my eye. A figure darting into the alley beside the complex. Without hesitation, I gave chase. "Stop! Police!" I shouted, drawing my weapon as I rounded the corner. The alley was a dead end, and there, cornered against a dumpster, was a man. Shaggy, disheveled, with wild eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "Hands where I can see them," I ordered, training my gun on him. He slowly raised his hands, and that's when I saw it. Clutched in his right hand was a small tool, a lockpick. "You," I breathed, the pieces clicking into place. "You're the one who's been breaking into homes, who tried to get into my apartment." A tense standoff ensued as I radioed for backup. The whole time, the guy never said a word, just stared at me with those unnerving eyes. When my fellow officers arrived and cuffed him, I thought I'd feel relief. We'd caught our burglar. My home was safe. But as they led him away, he finally spoke. Just 5 words, in a raspy whisper meant only for me. "I'll see you again soon, officer." A chill ran down my spine, because in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. The weeks that followed brought no more incidents, no more scratches or handprints or signs of intrusion. But I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I swear I see a figure lurking just out of sight. But when I turn to look, there's never anyone there. I've thought about moving, starting fresh somewhere new, but I know it wouldn't help. Whatever this is, whoever is behind it, they'd find me. So I stay. I keep my gun close, my doors locked, my eyes open, waiting. Because deep down, I know he was right. One day, I'll see him again, and next time, I'll be ready. As I mixed colors on my palette, I suddenly felt a chill run down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had the distinct sensation of being watched. At first, I tried to shake it off. I was alone in the house after all. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger by the minute. I tried to focus on my painting, but I couldn't shake the unnerving sense that someone or something was there with me. My hands began to tremble slightly as I held my brush. I found myself glancing nervously over my shoulder every few seconds. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head. There, in the shadowy veil of the hallway, was a dark figure. It was hard to make out clearly, but I could see the vague outline of a person-shaped form. My heart began to race. I blinked hard, certain my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, it was still there. The figure seemed to be peering into the room, observing me. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Gathering my courage, I called out shakily, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The figure remained motionless. I stood up from my chair, my legs feeling weak and unsteady beneath me. As I took a hesitant step forward, my foot knocked against the leg of my easel. The sound seemed to startle the figure. In that moment, our eyes met. I'll never forget the chill that went through me as I locked gazes with whatever was standing in that doorway. Its eyes seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light from my desk lamp. They were utterly inhuman. But as quickly as it happened, it was over. In the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. I was left staring at an empty doorway, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled backwards, knocking over my chair in my panic. My mind was reeling, trying to process what I'd just seen. Had it been real? Was I going crazy? The rational part of my brain insisted it must have been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by something outside. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. The operator's calm voice was like a lifeline as I frantically tried to explain what had happened. I'm sure I sounded like a madman, babbling about shadowy figures and glowing eyes. But to their credit, they took me seriously and said they'd send officers right away. Those next 15 minutes as I waited for the police to arrive were some of the longest of my life. I paced back and forth in my studio, jumping at every little sound. I kept my eyes fixed on that doorway, terrified the figure would reappear. Part of me wanted to flee the house entirely, but I was too paralyzed with fear to leave the relative safety of my brightly lit studio. When I finally heard the police car pull up outside, the flood of relief was overwhelming. I rushed to let the officers in, probably looking like a wild-eyed lunatic in my paint-splattered clothes and disheveled state. 2 officers entered, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons as I led them to the studio. I recounted what had happened, gesturing to the doorway where I'd seen the figure. They listened attentively, though I could tell from their expressions that they were skeptical. "We'll do a thorough search of the premises, sir," one of the officers assured me. "Why don't you wait here while we check things out?" I nodded gratefully, sinking down onto my chair as they began to sweep the house. I heard their footsteps moving from room to room, opening closets, checking behind furniture. After what seemed like an eternity, they returned to the studio. "We've searched the entire house, sir," the lead officer reported. "All the doors and windows are secure. There's no sign of any intruder or break-in." I stared at him in disbelief. But I saw it. It was right there in the doorway. How could it just disappear? The officers exchanged a glance. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're tired or stressed," the second officer said gently. "Have you been getting enough sleep lately?" I bristled at the implication that I had imagined the whole thing. "I know what I saw," I insisted. "It wasn't just a shadow or my imagination. There was someone or something standing right there." They clearly didn't believe me, but to their credit, they remained professional and sympathetic. They took down my information and told me to call again if anything else happened. As they prepared to leave, the lead officer paused. "You might want to consider installing some security cameras," he suggested. "If nothing else, it might give you some peace of mind." After they left, I found myself standing alone in my studio once again. But now the space that had once been my sanctuary felt alien and threatening. Every shadow seemed to conceal hidden dangers. I couldn't bring myself to continue painting. Instead, I spent the rest of the night sitting rigidly in my chair, staring at that empty doorway until the first rays of dawn began to creep through the windows. In the light of day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe the officers were right. Maybe it had just been my overtired mind conjuring up frightening images. But no matter how I tried to explain it away, I couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty of what I'd experienced. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I haven't been able to work in my studio after dark. I installed those security cameras the very next day, but they've never captured anything out of the ordinary. Sometimes I find myself obsessively reviewing the footage, searching for any hint of that shadowy figure. My work has suffered. I can't seem to recapture the creative flow I once had. Every time I pick up a brush, I find myself glancing nervously at the doorway. The memory of those glowing, inhuman eyes haunts me. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to work through the trauma of that night. She suggested it could have been a particularly vivid hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. Part of me wants to believe that. It would be comforting to think it was all in my head. But late at night, when the house is quiet and dark, I still get that prickling sensation of being watched. And sometimes, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I could swear I see a flicker of movement in the shadows of my room. In those moments, I know with chilling certainty that what I saw that night was real. Whatever it was, it's still out there, and I can't shake the feeling that someday it will return. I was a chef looking for some peace and quiet to work on new recipes, so I rented this secluded cabin up in the mountains. It seemed perfect at first, just me, my ingredients, and the great outdoors. No distractions, no busy restaurant kitchen to worry about. I could really focus on being creative. The first couple of days were amazing. I'd wake up early, have my coffee on the porch while watching the sunrise, then spend hours experimenting in the kitchen. In the evenings, I'd relax by the fireplace and plan out the next day's cooking. It was exactly the retreat I needed to recharge my culinary batteries. But on the third night, things started to get weird. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a loud clanging sound coming from the kitchen. It sounded like pots and pans banging together. My first thought was that maybe a raccoon or something had gotten in and was rummaging around. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and cautiously made my way to the kitchen. As I got closer, the noises stopped abruptly. When I flicked on the lights, the kitchen was totally empty. Everything was exactly where I'd left it before going to bed. No sign of any animals or intruders. I checked all the windows and doors, but they were still locked up tight. Figuring it must have been my imagination, or maybe the wind rattling something outside, I went back to bed. But I had trouble falling asleep after that. I kept straining my ears, waiting to hear another noise. The next night it happened again, only louder this time. It was like someone was actually in there cooking. I could hear utensils scraping, liquids bubbling, even the oven door opening and closing. My heart was pounding as I approached the kitchen. Again, all went silent just before I got there. And again, everything was completely undisturbed when I turned on the light. I was seriously freaked out at this point. I searched every inch of that cabin, but found nothing out of place. No hidden passages, no signs of any other living thing. I was totally alone out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the pipes or the old cabin settling, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The sounds were too distinct, too purposeful. It really did sound like someone cooking. I barely slept at all that night. Every little creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept the lights on and my chef's knife close by, just in case. But nothing else happened. The next day, I was exhausted and on edge. I couldn't focus on my recipes at all. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. Even in broad daylight, the cabin felt oppressive and creepy now. I decided to try and stick it out one more night. I was determined to get to the bottom of this. I set up my phone to record audio all night, hoping to capture whatever was making those sounds. As soon as it got dark, the feeling of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't shake the sense that something was about to happen. I sat rigid in bed, every muscle tense, just waiting. Around midnight, it started. Softly at first, the gentle clink of a spoon against a bowl. Then more noises joined in, building to a crescendo of cooking sounds. It was like a whole ghostly kitchen staff was at work out there. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely unlock my phone. I pulled up the audio recording app, and my blood ran cold. The recording was completely silent. Whatever was making those noises, my phone couldn't pick it up. That was it for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and started shoving my belongings into my suitcase. The whole time, the phantom cooking noises continued from the kitchen. I didn't even bother investigating this time. I just wanted out of there. I left most of my stuff behind, just grabbed the essentials and my car keys. As I bolted for the door, I swear I heard someone whisper, "Stay." It was so faint I might have imagined it, but it sent chills down my spine. I peeled out of there so fast I'm surprised I didn't crash. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main highway, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I drove straight through until morning, not feeling safe until the sun came up. It's been a few weeks now, and I still have no explanation for what happened in that cabin. I've researched the history of the place but found nothing unusual. I've thought about going back to get the rest of my things, but I just can't bring myself to do it. The memory of those nights still makes my skin crawl. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. Maybe the isolation got to me and I had some kind of breakdown. But then I remember how real those sounds were, how oppressive that feeling of being watched was. No, something was definitely in that cabin with me. Something that didn't want me to leave. I'm back at work now, but I can't shake what happened. I jump at every little noise in the kitchen. Sometimes when I'm alone in there late at night, I get the feeling that I'm not really alone. I find myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. I don't know if I'll ever be able to explain what happened in that mountain cabin. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go on a solitary retreat like that again. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some recipes are better left undiscovered. Been a librarian at the local public library for over a decade now. It's always been a quiet, predictable job, exactly how I like it. I'm not one for excitement or drama. Give me a stack of books to catalog and I'm content. But about a month ago, my peaceful world was shattered in a way I never could have imagined. It started with an innocuous letter in my mailbox. No return address, just my name and address neatly printed on a plain white envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. 7:15 a.m. Wake up, hit snooze twice. 7:30 a.m. Shower, brush teeth. 7:50 a.m. Coffee, toast with strawberry jam. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. This was my exact morning routine, down to the minute. How could anyone know this? I tried to brush it off as a weird coincidence, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next day, another letter arrived. This one detailed my entire workday. 8:30 a.m., arrive at library, unlock doors. 9:15 a.m., start processing new acquisitions. 11:30 a.m., lunch break, tuna sandwich at desk. It went on, describing every mundane task of my day with eerie accuracy. By the third day, I was in a full-blown panic. The latest letter included details that no one could possibly know unless they were watching me inside my own home. 6:45 p.m., microwaved leftover lasagna, dropped fork on kitchen floor, cursed under breath. 7:30 p.m., watched episode of The Great British Bake Off while folding laundry. 9:15 p.m., flossed teeth, read 3 chapters of mystery novel in bed. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I heard a noise outside, I jumped. Was someone watching me right now? I started keeping all the curtains closed, but that only made me feel more trapped. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? I had no proof of any actual threat, just these unsettling letters. The next week was a blur of paranoia and fear. I took time off work, too scared to leave my house. But the letters kept coming, now slipped under my front door. They continued to narrate my daily activities in excruciating detail, even noting when I paced anxiously from room to room or spent hours staring out the window, searching for any sign of my stalker. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who was doing this to me. I snuck out of my house at 2 a.m. and went door to door, begging my neighbors to check their security cameras for any suspicious activity around my home. Most were annoyed at being woken up, but a few agreed to look. It was my neighbor 3 houses down who finally provided the breakthrough. His cameras had a partial view of my front yard, and he'd captured footage of someone approaching my door late at night. The figure was hard to make out, but there was something familiar about their gait. My blood ran cold as I realized why it looked familiar. It was Jerry, a former library patron who'd always been a bit off. He'd been banned from the library last year for erratic behavior and harassing staff. I remembered him glaring at me as security escorted him out, muttering something about making us pay. With this new information, I finally went to the police. They took my statement and the security footage, promising to investigate, but I was still terrified. What if Jerry realized I was on to him? What if he escalated from letters to something worse? The next few days were the most stressful of my life. I jumped at every sound, convinced Jerry was about to burst through my door. I barely slept, spending nights huddled in my bedroom with a kitchen knife clutched to my chest. Finally, mercifully, it ended. The police called to inform me they'd arrested Jerry. They'd found evidence in his home linking him to the letters, as well as plans for further harassment. He was being held on stalking charges and would undergo a psychological evaluation. It's been 2 weeks since Jerry's arrest, and I'm still struggling to return to normal. I've started going back to work, but I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Every time the mail arrives, my heart races until I've checked that there are no unmarked envelopes. The police assured me that Jerry will be away for a long time, but I can't shake the feeling of vulnerability. How long had he been watching me before he started sending those letters? What else might he have planned if he hadn't been caught? I'm seeing a therapist now, trying to work through the trauma and anxiety. She says it will take time, but that I'll eventually feel safe again. I hope she's right. For now, I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to reclaim the peace and predictability I once took for granted. I know I'll never look at my quiet, routine life the same way again. The experience has shown me how fragile our sense of security can be, how easily it can be shattered by someone with ill intentions. But I'm determined not to let Jerry's actions define me or control my life forever. Slowly, cautiously, I'm working on rebuilding my world, a little wiser, a little warier, but still standing. As I write this, sharing my story for the first time, I feel a mix of emotions. There's still fear and anxiety, of course, but there's also a sense of catharsis in finally putting it all into words, and underneath it all, a growing feeling of strength. I survived this. I'm still here, and no matter what happens, I know now that I'm stronger than I ever realized. To anyone else who might be going through something similar, know that you're not alone. Trust your instincts, seek help, and don't give up. It might feel like your world is crumbling, but there is a way through. We are more resilient than we know, and even in our darkest moments, there is hope. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my 2 kids, Emily, 8, and Jack, 6. Just the 3 of us spending some quality time together in nature, away from the distractions of modern life. I'd rented this quaint little cabin deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from our home in the city. We arrived Friday evening as the sun was setting. The kids were thrilled, running around exploring every nook and cranny of the rustic cabin while I unpacked the car. We spent that first night roasting marshmallows over the fireplace, telling silly stories, and playing board games by lantern light. Around 9 p.m., I tucked the kids into their bunk beds in the small loft area and settled into my own bed in the main room below. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, exhausted from the long drive. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by an overwhelming sense that something wasn't right. The cabin was pitch black and deathly quiet. No crickets chirping outside, no wind in the trees, just a heavy, oppressive silence. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I made out two small silhouettes standing motionless at the foot of my bed. My heart began to race. "Emily? Jack?" I called out softly. No response. They just stood there, completely still. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand to use as a flashlight. As the screen illuminated, I nearly dropped it in shock. It was indeed Emily and Jack, but something was horribly wrong. Their eyes were wide open, glassy and vacant, staring straight ahead at nothing. Their skin was deathly pale, almost blue-tinged, and when I reached out to touch Emily's arm, her skin was ice cold. "Emily, Jack, wake up," I said more forcefully, shaking them gently, but it was like they were in some kind of trance. They didn't react at all, didn't even blink, just kept staring with those terrible empty eyes. Panic rising in my chest, I jumped out of bed and scooped them both up in my arms. Their bodies were stiff and unnaturally cold. I carried them back up to their beds, tucking them in and piling on extra blankets, desperately trying to warm them up. It's okay," I kept repeating, more to calm myself than anything. "You're just sleepwalking. You'll be fine in the morning." But deep down, I knew this was something far more sinister than mere sleepwalking. There was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air, like some malevolent presence had invaded our peaceful cabin. I sat there all night watching over the kids, jumping at every little creak of the old wooden structure. Several times I could have sworn I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, but every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. As the first light of dawn started to filter through the windows, Emily and Jack finally stirred. Their eyes fluttered open, and they sat up, looking around groggily. "Daddy, what's wrong?" Emily asked, noticing me sitting there. "Nothing, sweetie," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did you sleep okay?" They both nodded, seeming perfectly normal now. No trace of the eerie state they'd been in just hours before. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" Jack asked excitedly. I nodded numbly, beyond relieved that they appeared to be back to their usual selves. But I couldn't shake the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. As I cooked breakfast, my mind raced trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it had all been some vivid nightmare brought on by unfamiliar surroundings. But no, it had felt far too real. The bone-chilling cold of their skin, those horrible vacant stares. There was no way I had imagined that. I kept a close eye on Emily and Jack all day, watching for any signs that something was still wrong. But they seemed totally fine, happily playing and exploring as if nothing unusual had occurred. I, on the other hand, was a nervous wreck. Every unexplained noise made me flinch. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see some otherworldly entity lurking in the shadows. That afternoon, we went for a short hike in the woods surrounding the cabin. As we walked along the path, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, no birds singing, no rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness that set my teeth on edge. At one point, Jack wandered a bit off the trail to look at some interesting rocks. As I called for him to come back, I noticed something odd in the trees behind him. A dark, hunched shape, that didn't look quite human. I blinked, and it was gone. Probably just a trick of the light and shadows, I told myself. But I hurried to gather the kids and head back to the cabin all the same. As night began to fall, my anxiety ramped up to almost unbearable levels. I couldn't face the thought of going through another night like the last one. I made up some excuse about a work emergency and told the kids we needed to head home early. They were disappointed, of course, but I was too shaken to care. I just needed to get us out of there. We packed up the car in record time. As I was doing one last check of the cabin, making sure we hadn't forgotten anything, I heard Emily cry out from outside. I raced out the door to find her staring wide-eyed at the tree line. "Daddy, I saw something in the woods," she said, pointing with a trembling finger. It didn't look human." I scooped her up and practically threw her in the car, not even bothering to look where she was pointing. "It's okay, honey. It was probably just a deer or something," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "Let's go home now." The drive back was tense and silent. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. But we made it home without incident. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been some sort of shared hallucination, stress-induced psychosis or something. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was all too real. Emily and Jack never mentioned anything about that night. When I cautiously tried to bring it up once, they just looked at me blankly, as if they had no memory of it at all. Maybe that's for the best, but I'll never forget. The image of my children standing there in the darkness, cold as death with those horrifyingly empty eyes, is seared into my memory forever. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking I see those small silhouettes at the foot of my bed. I don't know what happened in that cabin. I don't know if it was ghosts or demons or something else entirely. But I do know that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Dark, ancient things that are better left undisturbed. We never went back to that cabin, of course. I looked it up online a few months later, out of morbid curiosity. Turns out it had been demolished. The website said due to structural issues, but I have my doubts. Maybe whatever malevolent force was there that night grew too strong to be contained. I still take the kids camping sometimes, but only in populated campgrounds now. Never anywhere too remote or isolated. The wonder and beauty of nature has been forever tainted for me. Because now I know that in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, there are things waiting in the shadows. Things that can reach out and touch you in ways you can never fully recover from. So if you're ever alone in the woods at night and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, trust your instincts, because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting for its chance to strike. As I stepped into the steamy shower, I felt the tension start to melt away. The hot water cascaded over me, and I closed my eyes, letting out a deep sigh. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere in the bathroom. My eyes snapped open, and I froze, straining to listen. "Hello?" I called out hesitantly. No response. I shook my head, figuring I must have imagined it. The pipes in this old building made all kinds of strange noises. I tried to relax again, but now I felt on edge. As I lathered up my hair, I heard it again, a soft, unintelligible whisper. This time I was sure it wasn't just the pipes. "Is someone there?" I said, louder this time. Still nothing. Heart pounding, I quickly rinsed off and stepped out of the shower, wrapping a towel around myself. I peered around the small bathroom, but it was empty. I checked behind the shower curtain, in the cabinet under the sink, even in the laundry hamper. nothing out of the ordinary. As I dried off, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and goosebumps spread across my skin. I hurried to my room and got dressed, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. I made dinner, watched some TV, and tried to put the weird bathroom incident out of my mind. Around 11 p.m., I crawled into bed, exhausted. As I drifted off to sleep, I vaguely registered the sound of the front door opening. Must be one of my roommates getting home. I jolted awake sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out shakily. "Matt? Jess? Is that you guys?" The footsteps stopped abruptly. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. After a long moment of silence, the footsteps resumed, coming closer to my door. I sat up in bed, every muscle tense. The doorknob slowly began to turn. I watched in horror as it rotated inch by inch. Just as it was about to open, I lunged for my bedside lamp and flicked it on. The door swung open to reveal nothing. The hallway was empty and dark. Shaking, I got up and checked the entire apartment. All the doors were locked, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. My roommates' beds were still empty. They hadn't come home yet. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed with all the lights on, jumping at every little sound. When my alarm went off at 7 a.m., I was bleary-eyed and on edge from lack of sleep. In the harsh light of day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd been having an incredibly vivid nightmare, but it had felt so real. I examined the apartment again, but found no evidence of an intruder. My roommates trickled in throughout the morning, looking hungover and tired from their nights out. I casually asked if any of them had come home during the night, but they all said no. I wanted to tell them about the weird experiences I'd had, but I was afraid they'd think I was losing it. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I walked into the bathroom, I half expected to hear that whisper again. I found myself avoiding looking in mirrors, worried I'd see something, or someone, reflected behind me. That night, I lay awake for hours, terrified of falling asleep. Every creak of the building, every car passing outside made me flinch. I kept replaying the events in my mind, trying to make sense of them. Had I really heard a whisper in the bathroom? Were those footsteps real, or just part of a dream? But the turning doorknob, that had definitely happened, hadn't it? The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and sleep deprivation. I jumped at shadows and found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. My roommates started to notice something was off. They kept asking if I was okay, commenting that I looked pale and stressed. I seriously considered moving out, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. Plus, a small part of me worried that whatever was happening might follow me to a new place. At least here, I wasn't alone. A week after that first night, I was home alone again. I'd been avoiding taking showers when no one else was home, but I desperately needed to wash my hair. Steeling myself, I stepped into the bathroom and turned on the water. As I shampooed my hair, I heard it again, that soft, indistinct whisper. My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" The whisper came again, slightly louder this time. I still couldn't make out any words, but it sounded almost mournful. Screwing up my courage, I rinsed the shampoo from my hair and turned off the water. Heart pounding, I pulled back the shower curtain. For a split second, I saw a shadowy figure reflected in the foggy mirror. I blinked, and it was gone. Shaking, I grabbed a towel and bolted from the bathroom. I spent the rest of the evening in my room with the door locked, jumping at every little noise. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, instead of coming towards my room, they seemed to pace back and forth in the living room. I lay frozen in my bed, barely breathing, as they continued for what felt like hours. In the morning, I searched the apartment again. No signs of intrusion, nothing out of place. But as I walked through the living room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A set of wet footprints on the hardwood floor, slowly evaporating in the morning sunlight. I took a picture with my phone before they could disappear completely. Finally, proof that I wasn't going crazy. I showed my roommates when they woke up, but by then the footprints were gone. They exchanged worried glances and suggested maybe I should talk to someone about the stress I'd been under lately. I knew what I'd seen, though. Something was in our apartment. Something that whispered and walked at night. Something that could appear and disappear at will. I had no idea what it wanted or why it was here, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I started researching the history of our building, looking for any clues. It was over 100 years old. Plenty of time for something tragic to have happened here. But my searches turned up nothing out of the ordinary. I even tried setting up a camera in the living room one night, hoping to catch evidence of the footsteps. But when I reviewed the footage in the morning, there was nothing but static during the times I'd heard the pacing. Weeks passed, and the strange occurrences continued sporadically. Sometimes I'd go days without incident, lulling myself into a false sense of security. Then I'd hear that whisper again, or catch a glimpse of a shadow in my peripheral vision, and the fear would come rushing back. My work started to suffer as I grew more and more sleep-deprived. My friends commented that I seemed distant and jumpy. I knew I probably seemed paranoid and crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong in our apartment. One night, about 2 months after that first whisper in the shower, I woke to find myself standing in the middle of the living room. I had no memory of getting out of bed or walking there. As I stood there disoriented, I heard the whisper again, right next to my ear. This time, I could almost make out words. Help. Trapped. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty living room. As I stumbled back to my room, my mind raced. Was whatever was haunting our apartment trying to communicate? Did it need help? Or was this all an elaborate trick to lure me into... what? I still don't have answers. The incidents have grown less frequent over time, but they haven't stopped completely. Sometimes weeks will go by without anything strange happening, and I'll start to think maybe it's over. Then I'll hear that whisper again, or see a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, and the fear comes rushing back. I've thought about moving out countless times, but something always holds me back. Maybe it's the fear that whatever is here will follow me, or maybe it's a morbid curiosity to uncover the truth behind these events. All I know is that I'll never feel completely safe in my own home again. Every time I step into the shower, I brace myself for that whisper. Every night I lie awake listening for footsteps. And always, always, I feel watched. If you're reading this and have experienced anything similar, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. And if you're considering moving into an old apartment building, maybe think twice. You never know what or who might already be living there. It was my third night at the cabin. I had settled into a productive routine, writing late into the evening before retiring to bed. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange sound. At first, I thought it might be the old cabin settling or perhaps a raccoon on the roof. But as I listened more closely, My blood ran cold. The distinct sound of footsteps creaked above me, coming from the attic. My heart began racing. I was miles from the nearest neighbor, completely alone in these woods. There shouldn't be anyone else here. I lay frozen in bed, straining my ears. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate. This was no animal. Someone was up there. I quietly slipped out of bed, grabbing my phone. With trembling hands, I turned on the flashlight and crept towards the pull-down ladder that led to the attic. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but curiosity and disbelief propelled me forward. I had to know what was up there. As I approached the attic entrance, the footsteps suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell over the cabin. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the ladder. Before I could touch it, a loud thump directly above me made me stumble backwards. Something was coming down. I watched in horror as the attic door slowly began to lower. A pair of dirty boots appeared, followed by legs clad in muddy jeans. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or cry out. As more of the figure emerged, I caught a glimpse of a gaunt face partially obscured by a ragged beard. But what struck me most were the eyes, cold, empty, and fixed directly on me. That's when survival instinct finally kicked in. I bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock as I heard heavy footsteps behind me. Just as I wrenched the door open, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and twisted away, nearly falling down the porch steps in my haste to escape. I sprinted into the pitch-black forest, branches whipping my face as I ran blindly through the undergrowth. The man's voice boomed behind me, deep and menacing. "You can't escape. This is my forest." Panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I crashed through the woods, gasping for breath, certain that at any moment I would feel those hands grab me again. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out onto a narrow road. Miraculously, headlights appeared in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, practically throwing myself in front of the approaching pickup truck. The startled driver slammed on his brakes, and I begged him to take me to the nearest police station. The kind stranger, a local farmer named Bill, could see I was in genuine distress and agreed to help. As we drove, I poured out my terrifying story. Bill listened with growing concern, saying he'd heard rumors of strange occurrences in those woods, but nothing like this. We arrived at the small-town police station just before dawn. The officers on duty were initially skeptical of my wild tale, but the genuine fear in my voice and my disheveled appearance convinced them to investigate. I gave them directions to the cabin, and 2 officers set out immediately while another took my official statement. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion and delayed shock set in. The police provided me with a blanket and some water, assuring me I was safe now. I must have dozed off in the hard plastic chair, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the officers who'd gone to investigate had returned. My heart sank as I saw their expressions. They'd found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no muddy footprints, not a single piece of evidence that anyone other than me had been in that cabin. They'd even checked the attic thoroughly and found only dust and cobwebs. I was stunned. How was this possible? I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The terror had been real. But faced with the lack of evidence and the officers' poorly concealed skepticism, I began to doubt myself. Had it all been some incredibly vivid nightmare? A hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? The police were kind but clearly didn't believe my story. They suggested that perhaps the unfamiliar sounds of the forest had played tricks on my mind, or that my writer's imagination had run wild in the solitude. They offered to drive me back to the cabin to collect my belongings, but I couldn't bear the thought of returning. Instead, I asked them to take me to the nearest bus station. As I sat waiting for the bus that would take me far away from this place, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. I knew deep down that what I'd experienced was real, regardless of the lack of evidence. The memory of those cold, empty eyes still sent shivers down my spine. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I researched the history of the area, looking for any similar incidents or local legends that might explain my experience. I found a few vague stories about hikers going missing in those woods over the years, but nothing concrete. I even went to a therapist, wondering if stress or some undiagnosed condition could have caused such a vivid hallucination. But the therapist found no signs of any mental health issues that could explain what I'd seen and heard that night. To this day, I still don't have a logical explanation for what happened in that cabin. The memory haunts me, making me question my own sanity at times. I've never returned to those woods, and I doubt I ever will. My writing has taken a darker turn since that night, inspired by the lingering fear and uncertainty. Sometimes, in the dead of night when the house is too quiet, I find myself straining to listen for footsteps that aren't there. And in my dreams, I often hear that menacing voice echoing through the trees. "You can't escape. This is my forest." I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened that night. Was it a ghost? A deranged hermit living in the woods? Or simply the product of an overactive imagination? The not knowing is perhaps the most terrifying part of all. All I know for certain is that I'll never again underestimate the power of isolation and the dark secrets that old forests can hide. I was just settling in for a quiet evening at home when the doorbell rang. Strange, I wasn't expecting any deliveries. I opened the door to find a small package sitting on my welcome mat. No return address, just my name and apartment number scrawled in messy handwriting. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up. Something about it felt off. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter, eyeing it warily. After a few minutes of internal debate, curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully opened it. Inside was a single photograph. At first glance, it looked like a normal picture of my living room. But then I realized with growing horror that it had been taken from inside my apartment, from an angle I didn't recognize. The pit of my stomach dropped as I took in every detail: my couch, my bookshelf, even the half-empty coffee mug I'd left on the side table that morning. My hands shaking, I flipped the photo over. Written on the back in the same messy scrawl as the package, "I see you." I immediately called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without any signs of a break-in. They suggested changing my locks and being extra vigilant. Fat lot of good that would do against someone who could apparently get inside my home undetected. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the building had me shooting upright in bed, convinced the intruder had returned. I kept replaying the day in my mind, trying to figure out when someone could have gotten in to take that photo. Had I forgotten to lock the door when I left for work? But even then, how would they have known which apartment was mine? The next morning, I was a zombie at work. I couldn't focus on anything, my mind consumed with paranoid thoughts. Who was watching me? What did they want? Around lunchtime, my cell phone rang, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" For several long seconds, there was only silence on the other end. Then a distorted voice spoke. "Did you like my gift?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who is this? What do you want from me?" A low chuckle. "Oh, I think you know. Sweet dreams." The line went dead. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of fear and confusion. As soon as I got home, I did a thorough search of my apartment, looking for any signs of intrusion or hidden cameras. I came up empty-handed, which somehow made it even worse. How were they doing this? That night, more phone calls. Sometimes just heavy breathing, sometimes that same distorted voice making vague threats. I tried blocking the numbers, but they just kept calling from new ones. After a few days of this, I was at my wit's end. I hadn't had a proper night's sleep. I was jumping at every sound, and I felt like I was losing my mind. That's when I decided to fight back. If someone was watching me, I'd watch them right back. I went out and bought a set of small security cameras, hiding them around my apartment. In the living room, bedroom, even one pointed at the front door. I also got a new deadbolt and a door wedge for extra protection. For the next few days, things were quiet. No more calls, no more packages. I started to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted, if it had all been some sick prank that had run its course. But I kept the cameras running just in case. It was a week later when it happened. I was reviewing the footage before bed, fast-forwarding through hours of nothing. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement in the hallway camera. My heart pounding, I rewound and played it at normal speed. At 2:17 a.m., a dark figure appeared at the edge of the frame. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if trying not to make any noise. I could make out the vague shape of a person, but their face was obscured by a hood or mask. The figure paused by my door, seeming to listen for any sound from inside. Then, to my utter disbelief, they produced a key and silently unlocked my door. They slipped inside, out of view of the hallway camera. With trembling hands, I switched to the living room feed. The figure moved through my apartment like a ghost, clearly familiar with the layout. They went straight to my bedroom. Thank God I'd been staying at a friend's place that night, and emerged a few minutes later, holding something I couldn't quite make out. As they headed back to the front door, they suddenly froze. Slowly, they turned and looked directly at the hidden camera. A chill ran through me as I realized they knew. Somehow, they knew I was watching them back. The figure reached up and pulled down their hood, revealing nothing. Where a face should have been was just a blank, featureless expanse. I recoiled from the screen in horror, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, that faceless head pointed right at the camera. Then, with deliberate slowness, they raised a hand and waved. The feed suddenly cut to static. I sat there in shocked silence, my whole body shaking. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a glitch in the camera. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The next morning, I went to the police station in person, armed with the footage. But when I pulled up the video on my phone to show them, it was gone. Not just that night, but all of it. Every second of footage I'd recorded over the past week had vanished without a trace. The officers were sympathetic but skeptical. Without any evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I consider seeing a therapist, that maybe the stress was causing me to imagine things. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And I know they're still out there, watching, waiting. I've moved apartments twice since then, changed my phone number, even my name. But I can't shake the feeling that they're always one step behind me, or maybe one step ahead. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the faint sound of a key turning in a lock. And in the morning, things in my apartment will be slightly out of place. A book moved on the shelf, a chair pulled out from the table. Never anything big enough to prove to anyone else, but enough to let me know they were there. I don't know what they want or why they chose me. All I know is that I'll never feel truly safe again. So if you're reading this, be careful. Check your locks, watch your surroundings, because you never know who might be watching you, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And if you ever get an unmarked package, don't open it. Some gifts are better left unopened, some mysteries better left unsolved. Trust me, I learned that the hard way. I was exhausted after another long shift at the precinct. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and get some much-needed rest. As I trudged up the stairs to my third-floor apartment, I felt the weight of the day pressing down on me. When I reached my door, something immediately felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I noticed faint scratching sounds coming from inside. My cop instincts kicked in, and I instantly went on high alert. Someone was trying to break in. I silently set down my bag and unholstered my service weapon. Years of training took over as I positioned myself to the side of the door, out of the line of fire. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I took a deep breath, then swiftly turned the key and threw the door open, gun at the ready. "Police! Don't move!" I shouted as I burst in. But there was no one there. The apartment was empty and silent. Confused, I did a quick sweep of each room, checking closets and behind furniture. Nothing. No sign of an intruder anywhere. I returned to the front door, baffled. That's when I noticed the deep scratch marks around the lock. Someone had definitely been trying to pick it or force it open. The marks were fresh. This had just happened moments ago. A chill ran down my spine. Whoever it was must have heard me coming up the stairs and fled. But how? I would have seen them in the hallway. Unless they were still here somewhere, hiding. I did another thorough search of the apartment, this time pulling out drawers and looking in every possible hiding spot, no matter how small. Still nothing. Finally convinced I was alone, I sank onto the couch, my mind racing. Who would try to break into a cop's apartment? Was it random, or was I targeted? And how the hell did they vanish so quickly? I pulled out my phone to call it in, but hesitated. What exactly would I report? An attempted break-in with no suspect and no evidence beyond some scratches. My colleagues would probably think I was just jumpy and paranoid. In the end, I decided against calling it in officially. I'd mention it casually to some of the guys tomorrow, see if there had been any other break-ins reported in the area. For now, I just needed to secure the apartment and try to relax. I double and triple checked all the locks, then wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I kept my gun within reach as I heated up some leftovers, my appetite gone but knowing I should eat something. As I picked at my food, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in. But we were 3 stories up. That was impossible. Right? I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but I couldn't focus on anything. My nerves were frayed, every little sound making me jump. The normal creaks and groans of the old building now seemed ominous and threatening. Around midnight, I finally gave in to exhaustion and headed to bed. I made sure my gun was on the nightstand and did one final check of all the locks. As I lay there in the dark, wide awake despite my fatigue, my mind conjured up all sorts of scenarios. What if they came back? What if there were multiple intruders, and this was all part of some elaborate plan? What if they had gotten in earlier and planted cameras or listening devices? I knew I was being irrational, letting my imagination run wild. But after years on the force, I'd seen enough to know that sometimes the craziest scenarios turn out to be true. And something about this whole situation just felt wrong. I must have drifted off eventually because the next thing I knew I was jolting awake in a cold sweat. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or why I felt so on edge. Then it all came flooding back. As I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, a floorboard creaked in the living room. I froze, straining my ears. It could have been nothing. Old buildings make noise all the time. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across my living room floor. My hand closed around the grip of my gun as I silently slid out of bed. I crept to the bedroom door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear soft rustling sounds, like someone rifling through papers. My mind raced through my options. I could burst out guns blazing, but what if it was just a neighbor who had somehow gotten in? Or I could call for backup, but that would alert the intruder, and they might flee again. In the end, my training won out. I had to confront this head-on. I took a deep breath, threw open the door, and charged into the living room, gun raised. Freeze! Hands where I can see them! But once again, the room was empty. The rustling sounds instantly stopped. I flicked on the lights, momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness. When my eyes adjusted, I saw that nothing was disturbed. No papers strewn about, no open drawers. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. I stood there, gun still raised, utterly confused, and more than a little freaked out. I knew I hadn't imagined those sounds. Someone or something had been in here just seconds ago. A movement caught my eye and I spun towards the window, heart in my throat. But it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, its shadow dancing across the wall. I lowered my gun, feeling foolish but still on high alert. This was insane. I was a trained police officer, not some scared kid jumping at shadows. I needed to get a grip. I decided to make a pot of coffee. Sleep was out of the question now anyway. As the coffee brewed, I paced the apartment, looking for any sign that someone had been there. But everything was untouched. Even the chair I'd wedged under the door was still in place. As I sipped my coffee, I tried to think logically. Maybe I was just overworked and stressed. Maybe the break-in attempt had rattled me more than I realized, and now I was hearing things. It wouldn't be the first time a cop cracked under the pressure of the job. But deep down, I knew this was different. This wasn't stress or paranoia. Something was very wrong here. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, jumping at every sound. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I was almost relieved. I could go to work, talk to my colleagues, maybe get some answers. As I got ready, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the bathroom mirror, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a handprint. It hadn't been there the night before. I was certain of that. I stared at it, my reflection pale and wide-eyed in the streaky outline of a hand much larger than my own. This was proof. Proof that I wasn't going crazy, that someone had really been in my apartment. I should have felt vindicated, but instead, a new wave of fear washed over me. Because now I knew for certain I wasn't safe in my own home. At work, I casually asked around about any recent break-ins or strange occurrences in my neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary had been reported. I thought about filing an official report, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, not wanting to admit I was spooked. Or maybe it was a deeper instinct, a feeling that involving others would only make things worse. That night, I installed a security camera in my living room. I told myself it was just a precaution, that I was probably overreacting. But as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I found myself obsessively checking the live feed on my phone. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No sounds, no movement. Just as I was starting to relax, thinking maybe it had all been in my head, the feed went black. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. It had to be a malfunction, right? New electronics act up all the time. But as I fumbled to restart the app, I heard it. Footsteps. In my living room. And this time, they were coming towards my bedroom. I grabbed my gun, my whole body tense as I watched the door. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could see the shadow of feet in the gap under the door. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door handle began to turn. I raised my gun, finger on the trigger, ready to fire the moment the door opened, but it never did. The handle turned all the way, then slowly rotated back. The shadow under the door disappeared. Footsteps retreated, then silence. I sat there, gun trained on the door, for hours. I didn't move, barely breathed, but nothing else happened. When sunlight finally started to peek through the curtains, I lowered my gun, my arms aching from holding it up for so long. I was exhausted, confused, and more scared than I'd ever been in my life. I called in sick to work. I couldn't face anyone like this, sleep-deprived, paranoid, on the verge of a breakdown. I spent the day researching, trying to find any similar cases, any explanation for what was happening to me. I found nothing. That night, I set up more cameras. I covered every inch of the apartment. I even put one in the hallway outside my door. I was determined to catch whatever this was on film, but the cameras saw nothing. For a week straight, nothing unusual happened. No sounds, no missing items, no strange shadows. I began to think maybe it really had all been in my head. The stress of the job finally getting to me. I started to relax. I slept better. I went back to work. Things seemed to be returning to normal. Then, exactly 1 week after that night with the doorknob, it happened again. 3:17 a.m. Footsteps, the door handle turning. But this time, when I checked the cameras, nothing. No footage, no missing time, just empty rooms and hallways. It was like whatever this was knew exactly how to avoid detection. Like it was toying with me, letting me know it could come and go as it pleased, and there was nothing I could do about it. I'm writing this now because I don't know what else to do. I can't tell anyone at work. They'll think I've lost it. I can't move. Whatever this is, I think it's attached to me, not the apartment. I'm trapped, constantly on edge, never knowing when it will appear again. If anyone out there has experienced anything like this, please reach out. I need to know I'm not crazy. I need to know there's a way to make it stop, because I don't know how much longer I can live like this, jumping at every shadow, never feeling safe in my own home. I'm a cop. I'm supposed to protect people from danger. But who protects me when the danger is something I can't see, can't fight, can't even prove exists? All I know is that it's real, it's here, and it's not going away. And I'm terrified of what might happen when it finally decides to do more than just watch. I was a real estate agent for over a decade, but nothing in my career could have prepared me for what happened that day at 1247 Elm Street. It was an old Victorian house built in the late 1800s that had been on the market for months. The owners were eager to sell, and I was determined to make it happen. That crisp autumn morning, I arrived early to prepare for a showing. The house loomed before me, its weathered facade a testament to the passage of time. As I fumbled with the keys, a chill ran down my spine. I brushed it off as just the cool breeze. Stepping inside, I was greeted by the musty smell of aged wood and forgotten memories. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I made my way through the foyer. I began my usual routine, opening curtains and turning on lights to make the place more inviting. As I reached the living room, I heard it. A faint giggle, like that of a young child, echoed from somewhere upstairs. I froze, my heart racing. It was impossible. The house was empty. I'd made sure of that before entering. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. Silence answered me. Shaking my head, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. I continued my walk through, heading upstairs to check the bedrooms. As I reached the landing, another laugh rang out, this time from downstairs. My breath caught in my throat. This was no figment of my imagination. The laughter was clear as day, a chorus of children's voices echoing through the empty halls. I sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My hands trembling, I pulled out my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, another burst of giggles erupted, this time from the kitchen. I spun around, my eyes darting frantically from corner to corner, searching for any sign of movement. The house was playing tricks on me, I thought. Old houses settle, pipes make noise. But this was different. The laughter sounded so real, so alive. I steeled myself and decided to investigate. Cautiously, I made my way to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The room was empty, sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, illuminating floating particles in the air. Just as I was about to turn back, a cupboard door slammed shut. I jumped, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "This isn't funny," I yelled, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. In response, a cacophony of laughter erupted from all around me. It seemed to come from every room, every corner of the house. The sound was deafening, a symphony of childish glee that bordered on maniacal. I covered my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the noise. Panic overtook me, and I ran. I didn't care about locking up or closing windows. I just needed to get out. As I burst through the front door, the laughter abruptly ceased. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. I stumbled down the porch steps, gasping for air, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. I looked back at the house. It stood there, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. The windows stared back at me like empty eyes, revealing nothing of the terror that lay within. My phone buzzed in my pocket, making me jump. It was my client, wondering if I was at the house yet for the showing. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. How could I explain what had just happened? Who would believe me? With shaking fingers, I typed out a quick message saying I wasn't feeling well and needed to reschedule. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that house again, let alone bring innocent people inside. As I drove away, my mind raced with questions. What had I just experienced? Were there really children in the house, playing some elaborate prank? Or was it something else? The rational part of my brain tried to come up with logical explanations, but deep down, I knew what I'd heard was far from normal. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of those laughing voices. They haunted my dreams, echoing in my mind during quiet moments. I tried to research the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd experienced. To my surprise, I discovered that the house had once been an orphanage in the early 1900s. Records showed that several children had died there during a flu epidemic. My blood ran cold as I read this, the pieces starting to fall into place in a way that defied logic and reason. I debated whether to share my experience with anyone. Who would believe me? I'd likely be labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. So I kept it to myself, carrying the weight of that terrifying day alone. I couldn't bring myself to return to 1247 Elm Street. I made excuses to my agency, claiming conflicts of interest or scheduling issues. Eventually, another agent took over the listing. I heard through the grapevine that the house sold quickly after that, but I never asked for details. Part of me didn't want to know. Months have passed since that day, but the memory remains vivid. Sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can hear the faintest echo of children's laughter. It sends shivers down my spine every time. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself it was all in my head. But deep down, I know what I heard was real. Those children, or whatever they were, wanted to be heard. And they chose me as their audience. I still work as a real estate agent, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to the energy of a house, to the whispers of its past. And if I ever feel that familiar chill run down my spine, I don't hesitate to walk away. Some houses have secrets they don't want to share. And after my experience at 1247 Elm Street, I've learned it's better to leave those secrets undisturbed. The laughter of those unseen children will forever serve as a reminder that there are some things in this world that defy explanation. Some experiences that blur the line between reality and the unexplainable. As I sit here, sharing this story for the first time, I can't help but wonder, if you were in that house, would you have heard the laughter too? Or was it a message meant only for me? I may never know the answer, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the day the empty house filled with the echoes of ghostly giggles, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I was just settling in for a quiet evening at home when my world turned upside down. It had been a long day at the office, and all I wanted was to relax in my penthouse apartment with a glass of wine and maybe catch up on some TV. I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt as I gazed out at the twinkling city lights below. If only I had known how quickly that peace would shatter. The loud pounding on my door startled me out of my reverie. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery I'd forgotten about, but the frantic, aggressive nature of the knocking sent a chill down my spine. I cautiously approached the door, calling out, "Who is it?" The response chilled me to the bone. "Open up, you bastard. I know what you've been doing." It was the voice of my downstairs neighbor, Mr. Thompson, but I'd never heard him sound so enraged. My mind raced, trying to figure out what he could possibly be talking about. Mr. Thompson and I had always been cordial, if not particularly close. He was a quiet, middle-aged man who mostly kept to himself. What could have set him off like this? I tried to reason with him through the door. "Mr. Thompson, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Why don't we talk about this calmly?" His response was anything but calm. "No more talking. You've been watching me, haven't you? Spying on me through the walls? I'll show you what happens to peeping Toms." My blood ran cold as I heard a metallic click that could only be the sound of a gun being cocked. This couldn't be happening. It felt like a nightmare, but the pounding of my heart told me it was all too real. I backed away from the door, frantically searching for my phone. I needed to call the police, but in my panic, I couldn't remember where I'd left it. The pounding on the door grew more intense, and I feared it would give way at any moment. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and I realized with horror that Mr. Thompson was trying to shoot the lock off the door. I dove behind my kitchen counter, my mind racing with possible escape routes. The balcony? No, I was too high up. The emergency stairwell? But I'd have to get past the door to reach it. Another shot rang out, and I heard the splintering of wood. Tears streamed down my face as I cowered behind the counter, certain that these were my final moments. I closed my eyes and waited for the inevitable. But then, a miracle happened. I heard another voice in the hallway, Mrs. Chen from across the hall. "Mr. Thompson, what on earth are you doing? Stop this at once." There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by Mr. Thompson's heavy breathing. Then, to my immense relief, I heard him mutter something unintelligible and storm off down the hallway. I remained frozen in place, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Mrs. Chen's gentle knock. "Are you all right in there, dear? He's gone now. I've called the police." Shaking uncontrollably, I managed to get to my feet and make my way to the door. The lock was destroyed, and there were 2 bullet holes in the wood. I opened it to find Mrs. Chen standing there, her face etched with concern. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, pulling me into a hug. I broke down then, the full weight of what had just happened crashing over me. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements and crime scene investigators. I learned that Mr. Thompson had been taken into custody without incident. As the adrenaline wore off, I found myself struggling to process what had happened. It wasn't until the next day that I got some answers. A detective came to take my statement again, and he filled me in on what they'd discovered. Mr. Thompson, it turned out, had been struggling with untreated paranoid schizophrenia. He'd become convinced that I was spying on him and plotting against him. The detective explained that they'd found an elaborate system of tin foil and wires in Mr. Thompson's apartment, which he believed would block my surveillance. He'd also kept a journal detailing his delusions, which included pages and pages about me and my supposed nefarious plans. I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that it was over, pity for Mr. Thompson's mental state, and lingering fear from the trauma I'd experienced. The detective assured me that Mr. Thompson would be getting the help he needed and that I was safe now. But safety felt like a foreign concept. How could I ever feel secure in my own home again? The penthouse that had once been my sanctuary now felt tainted by the memory of that terrifying night. In the weeks that followed, I found myself jumping at every little noise. I couldn't sleep without checking and rechecking the locks multiple times. The sound of footsteps in the hallway would send me into a panic attack. I knew, rationally, that Mr. Thompson was no longer a threat, but my body and mind refused to believe it. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but everything felt different. My co-workers noticed my jumpiness, the dark circles under my eyes from sleepless nights. I found myself making excuses to avoid going home, staying late at the office, or accepting any invitation that would keep me out of my apartment. Mrs. Chen checked on me regularly, bringing over homemade meals and offering a sympathetic ear. I was grateful for her kindness, but it also served as a constant reminder of that night. Every time I saw her, I relived those terrifying moments. I tried therapy, which helped to some extent, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability that had taken root in me. I found myself researching home security systems obsessively, installing camera after camera until my apartment resembled a surveillance hub more than a home. The worst part was the guilt. As I learned more about Mr. Thompson's condition, I couldn't help but wonder if I could have noticed something sooner. Had there been signs I'd missed? Could I have somehow prevented this if I'd been more attentive, more neighborly? Rationally, I knew it wasn't my fault. Mental illness is complex, and Mr. Thompson had hidden his struggles well. But in the dark of night, when sleep eluded me, those thoughts would creep in, tormenting me with what-ifs. Months passed, and slowly, very slowly, things began to improve. The panic attacks became less frequent, the nightmares less vivid. I started to reclaim my space, redecorating to try and erase the memory of that night. But even now, a year later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. The sound of raised voices in the hallway still makes my heart race. I've thought about moving, but part of me feels like that would be letting fear win. So I stay, trying to rebuild my sense of safety one day at a time. I've gotten to know my neighbors better, finding comfort in community. We look out for each other now in a way we never did before. I often think about Mr. Thompson, wondering how he's doing, hoping he's getting the help he needs. I've learned a lot about mental health since that night, trying to understand what drove him to such extremes. It's helped me process my own trauma to some extent. Sometimes when I look out at the city lights now, I'm struck by how fragile our sense of security really is, how quickly everything can change. But I'm also reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. We endure, we adapt, we heal. I may never fully shake the memory of that terrifying night, but I refuse to let it define me. Each day that I wake up and face the world is a small victory, and as I continue to heal, I hold on to the hope that one day my home will feel like a sanctuary again. It started subtly at first. I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling uncomfortably hot or cold, despite setting the thermostat to a comfortable temperature before bed. I chalked it up to my body adjusting to the new place. But after a few nights, I started to suspect something wasn't right. One evening, I distinctly remember setting the thermostat to 70 degrees before going to sleep. I woke up at 3 a.m. drenched in sweat, the air stiflingly hot and humid. Groggy and disoriented, I stumbled to the thermostat panel. My blood ran cold when I saw the display. It was set to 90 degrees. There's no way I would have done that. As I was about to adjust it back down, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There on the screen, in glowing red letters, was a message. Get out. I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things in my half-asleep state. But when I looked again, the message was gone. The thermostat showed 90 degrees, nothing more. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I set it back to 70 and tried to go back to sleep. But I lay there for hours, unable to shake the feeling that something very wrong was happening in my apartment. The next night, I made sure to double and triple check that I set the temperature correctly before bed. But once again, I woke up freezing in the middle of the night. The thermostat read 50 degrees this time, and there was another message. Leave now. My heart was pounding as I adjusted the temperature. This couldn't be a coincidence or my imagination. Something, or someone, was messing with my thermostat and trying to scare me. But how? And why? I spent the next day obsessively checking the thermostat and all the other smart systems in the apartment. Everything seemed normal. I even called the building manager to ask if there had been any issues reported with the climate control system. He assured me it was all working perfectly. That night, determined to catch whatever was going on, I decided to stay awake and keep watch. I set up my phone to record the thermostat display. For hours, nothing happened. My eyelids grew heavy as the night wore on. Just as I was about to give up and go to sleep, the temperature started to drop rapidly. I watched in disbelief as the numbers plummeted lower and lower. 65, 60, 55, 50. It kept going until it hit 40 degrees. Then, as if someone was typing on an invisible keyboard, a new message appeared. This is your last warning. I was shaking, and not just from the cold. This was really happening. I wasn't imagining it or dreaming it. Something impossible and terrifying was occurring in my apartment. Desperate for answers, I started frantically Googling similar experiences. Most of what I found was clearly fiction or paranormal enthusiasts spinning wild theories. But buried in an obscure tech forum, I found a thread that chilled me more than the frigid air in my apartment. Several users described nearly identical experiences in various high-tech apartment buildings around the country. Mysterious temperature fluctuations, threatening messages, unexplained noises. In each case, the problems escalated over time, becoming more frequent and intense. As I read their stories, my apartment suddenly plunged into darkness. The power had gone out. But that should have been impossible. The building had a state-of-the-art backup generator system. My phone was dead too, even though it had been nearly fully charged. In the pitch-black silence, I heard it. A low, mechanical hum that seemed to be coming from inside the walls. It grew louder, pulsing in an almost rhythmic pattern. Then came a sound like static electricity crackling, followed by a series of sharp metallic clicks. My hair stood on end as I felt a presence in the room with me. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I sensed something moving, circling me. The air felt charged, like right before a lightning strike. A woman's scream pierced the night, so loud and close it felt like it was inside my head. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in the dark. Just as I got it open, all the lights and electronics in the apartment surged to life at once in a cacophony of sound and blinding light. Every screen, my TV, laptop, phone, displayed the same message: too late. I ran out of there as fast as I could, not even stopping to grab shoes or a jacket. I spent the rest of the night in my car in a 24-hour store parking lot, shaken to my core. The next day, I went back with a friend to pack up my essential belongings. Everything in the apartment seemed normal in the light of day. No sign of the terrifying events of the night before. My friend clearly thought I was overreacting or had some kind of mental break. But I knew what I experienced was real. I broke my lease and moved out that week, leaving most of my stuff behind. I couldn't bring myself to spend another night there. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. Was it some kind of elaborate hacking of the smart systems, a malfunction, or something beyond scientific explanation? All I know is that I'll never live in a high-tech apartment again. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm back there with that unseen presence. The memory of those glowing red warnings still sends chills down my spine. Get out. Leave now. Too late. I got out in time, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that apartment is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting tenant to move in. It started innocently enough. After a particularly grueling 36-hour shift in the ER, I drove out to my country house, looking forward to a peaceful weekend of rest and relaxation. As I pulled up the long gravel driveway, I felt the tension start to melt away. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the weathered clapboard siding, and a gentle breeze rustled through the oak trees that lined the property. I unlocked the front door and breathed in the familiar scent of old wood and lavender sachets. Everything was just as I had left it the week before, cozy and inviting. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my favorite armchair by the fireplace with a book, relishing the quiet after days of beeping monitors and fluorescent lights. As night fell, I headed upstairs to turn in early. I had just started to drift off when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the wall next to my bed. At first I dismissed it as the house settling or a branch scraping against the siding. But as I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears, the scratching grew more distinct and deliberate. My first thought was mice. The house was old after all, and rodents weren't uncommon in rural areas. I made a mental note to pick up some traps in town the next day and tried to ignore the sound. But sleep eluded me as the scratching continued intermittently throughout the night, sometimes fading away only to start up again, just as I was nodding off. By morning, I was exhausted and irritable. I did a thorough inspection of the bedroom, looking for any signs of rodent activity, droppings, chew marks, holes in the baseboards. but I found nothing out of the ordinary. I even pulled the bed away from the wall and ran my hands over every inch of the wallpaper, searching for weak spots or cracks. The wall was solid. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I drove into town and loaded up on mouse traps, steel wool, and caulk. I spent the afternoon meticulously sealing every possible entry point I could find and setting traps along the walls. Satisfied with my handiwork, I rewarded myself with a glass of whiskey and settled in for what I hoped would be a quiet evening. But as darkness fell, the scratching returned, louder and more frantic than before. It seemed to be coming from multiple spots now, not just the bedroom wall. I prowled from room to room, pressing my ear against the walls, trying to pinpoint the source. The scratching always seemed to stop just as I got close, only to start up again in a different location moments later. By midnight, I was a wreck. Every nerve was on edge as I huddled on the couch, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. The scratching had taken on an almost mocking quality, as if whatever was causing it was intentionally toying with me. In a moment of desperation, I even considered calling the local sheriff, but quickly dismissed the idea. What would I say? That I was being terrorized by wall-scratching ghosts? As dawn broke, I realized I had been up all night, wild-eyed and clutching a fireplace poker. I felt ridiculous in the harsh light of day. Clearly I was overtired and letting my imagination run away with me. I resolved to head back to the city that afternoon and call an exterminator to do a thorough inspection while I was gone. But first, I needed to get some sleep. I dragged myself upstairs and collapsed into bed, praying for just a few hours of uninterrupted rest. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a thunderous crash. Heart pounding, I bolted upright. The noise had come from inside the wall, like something heavy had fallen through the insulation. Before I could react, I heard scrabbling, and then silence. Trembling, I approached the wall. I pressed my palm against it, half expecting to feel something moving on the other side. Nothing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A thin crack had appeared in the wallpaper, right where the sound had come from. With shaking hands, I began to peel back the wallpaper. The crack widened, revealing rotted wood underneath. As I pulled away more of the paper, I uncovered what looked like a small door built into the wall studs, maybe an old dumbwaiter shaft or laundry chute that had been sealed up long ago. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had to know. I had to see what was making those sounds with my own eyes, or I'd never be able to rest easy in this house again. Taking a deep breath, I pried open the hidden panel. Dust billowed out, making me cough and squint. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the narrow space, I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness. I stumbled backward with a strangled cry, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the floor. By the time I scrambled up, whatever I had seen was gone, retreating deeper into the walls. But I had seen enough to know this was no ordinary rodent. The eyes had been too large, too intelligent, and in that brief moment our gazes had locked, I had sensed a malevolence that chilled me to my core. Panic overwhelmed me. I fled the house, not even bothering to grab my keys or phone. I ran down the driveway in my pajamas, heart thundering in my chest. I flagged down a passing car and begged the startled driver to take me into town. At the local diner, over several cups of strong coffee, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the cold, calculating intelligence behind them. I called a colleague from the hospital and asked him to come pick me up. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed a ride back to the city. I couldn't bring myself to explain the real reason. As we drove away from the town, I glanced back at the road leading to my country house. A part of me knew I would never return. Whatever was living in those walls, whatever malevolent presence had invaded my sanctuary, it could have the damn place. In the weeks and months that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. I threw myself into my work at the hospital, picking up extra shifts and avoiding any downtime that might allow my mind to wander back to that night. I ignored the realtor's calls about selling the property and let the mortgage payments lapse. But even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I hear scratching in the walls, and in my darkest moments, I can't help but wonder, what if it followed me? What if, even now, it's burrowing its way toward me, those intelligent evil eyes gleaming in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself once more? I may never know what really happened in that house, but one thing is certain, I'll never look at an old country home the same way again. Sometimes, the quaint charm of a historic property hides sinister secrets, and some things, once awakened, can never truly be laid to rest. I was just settling in for a quiet evening at home when the doorbell rang. Normally I wouldn't think twice about it, but something felt off. Maybe it was the late hour, or the fact that I wasn't expecting any deliveries. Reluctantly, I got up from the couch and made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the door. At my feet was a small package, about the size of a shoebox. No labels, no return address, just plain brown paper. My name was scrawled across the top in messy handwriting. A chill ran down my spine as I picked it up. It was surprisingly light. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. For a few minutes, I just stared at it, debating whether or not to open it. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. With trembling hands, I carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a plain white envelope. My heart was pounding as I slid out its contents, a single photograph. The moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of my living room window, clearly taken from outside the building. But that wasn't the worst part. In the bottom right corner, you could see a sliver of my own reflection in the glass, illuminated by the glow of my TV. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. Someone had been watching me, recently. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of sick joke? A threat? I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, knowing a stranger had been so close without my knowledge. I forced myself to examine the photo more closely, looking for any clues. The angle suggested it was taken from across the street, probably from one of the other apartment buildings. But when? And why? As I pondered these questions, my phone suddenly rang, making me jump. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. With a trembling hand, I answered. "Hello?" I said cautiously. There was silence on the other end for a moment, then a low, distorted voice spoke. "Did you like my gift?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The voice chuckled. "You should really be more careful about leaving your curtains open. You never know who might be watching." The line went dead. Panic overtook me. I rushed around the apartment, closing all the blinds and double-checking the locks. My mind was reeling. Who could be doing this? And why me? I racked my brain, trying to think if I'd angered anyone recently or if there was someone who might hold a grudge. As I paced nervously, my eyes kept darting to the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in. The apartment suddenly felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't stay here. Without really thinking it through, I grabbed my keys and phone and bolted out the door. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, too paranoid to be trapped in a small space. Once outside, I hurried down the street, constantly looking over my shoulder. I ended up at a 24-hour cafe a few blocks away. As I sat there nursing a coffee with shaking hands, I tried to calm down and think rationally. Should I call the police? But what would I tell them? I had no proof of any actual crime, just a creepy photo and phone call. As the hours ticked by, my fear slowly gave way to exhaustion. By the time the sun started to rise, I had convinced myself that it must have been some kind of twisted prank. Maybe a neighbor with too much time on their hands. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When I finally returned to my apartment, everything looked normal, no signs of any disturbance. I spent the day in a haze, jumping at every little noise. That night, I barely slept, constantly getting up to check the locks and peer out the windows. The next few days passed without incident, but I couldn't relax. I found myself constantly on edge, scanning faces on the street for anyone suspicious. I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work and coming home at odd hours. After about a week, I decided I needed to take more concrete action. I invested in some security cameras, setting them up both inside my apartment and in the hallway outside. It wasn't cheap, but it gave me a small sense of control. For a while, nothing happened. The cameras recorded hours of mundane footage, me going about my daily life, occasional neighbors passing in the hall. I started to think maybe it really had been a one-time thing, that whoever was responsible had moved on. Then, late one night, something caught my eye as I was reviewing the day's footage. In one of the exterior cameras pointed at the street, there was a brief glimpse of a figure standing across the road, looking up at my building. It was only for a second before they moved out of frame, but it sent chills down my spine. I rewound and played it again, trying to make out any details. The quality wasn't great, especially in the low light, but it was clearly a person. They seemed to be wearing dark clothing, maybe a hoodie. Their face was in shadow, impossible to identify. My mind raced. Was this the same person who sent the photo? Had they been watching me this whole time? I scoured through hours more footage, but there was no sign of them again. The next day, I called in sick to work and spent hours combing through old footage, looking for any other appearances of the mysterious figure. I found nothing conclusive, but every shadow and movement now seemed sinister. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. With a sense of dread, I opened it. Nice cameras, but they won't keep me out. I threw the phone across the room in panic. How did they know? Had they been inside my apartment? I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, lights on, clutching a kitchen knife. When morning came, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel across town. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. Should I go to the police now, move to a new apartment, leave the city entirely? As I sat in the anonymous hotel room, I realized with a sinking feeling that it didn't matter where I went. Whoever was doing this had found me once. They could do it again. The uncertainty was the worst part, not knowing their motives or what they might do next. Every noise in the hallway made me flinch. Every passing shadow outside the window sent my heart racing. I knew I couldn't live like this forever, but I had no idea how to make it stop. That night, as I lay sleepless in the unfamiliar bed, my phone lit up with another message. This time, it was a photo. My stomach dropped as I recognized it. The hotel I was currently staying in. The message below simply read, "You can't hide." I've been on the move ever since, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. I've changed my phone number, my email, even dyed my hair. But I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a familiar figure in a crowd, or notice a car that seems to be following me. But when I look again, they're gone. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. The constant fear and paranoia are eating away at me. I jump at every sound, suspect every stranger. I've lost touch with friends and family, too afraid to risk contacting them. Sometimes I wonder if I'm going crazy, if it's all in my head. But then I remember that first photo, the phone call, the figure on the camera. It was real. It is real. I'm sharing this as a warning. Be careful. You never know who might be watching. And if you ever get an unexpected package, think twice before opening it. It might change your life forever. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I first started to feel off. There was this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off and focus on my painting, but the feeling just kept intensifying. The air in the studio felt thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep working. I told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me after hours of solitary work. But then I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the doorway behind me. My whole body went rigid. I didn't want to turn around, terrified of what I might see, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head towards the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. There in the darkened doorway was a pitch-black silhouette. It was roughly human-shaped, but seemed to absorb all the light around it. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a void in the shape of a person. I let out a strangled yelp and stumbled backwards, knocking over my easel in the process. Paint and brushes went flying everywhere. When I looked back at the door, the figure was gone, but that oppressive feeling remained. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone and called the police. I babbled to the dispatcher about an intruder, too scared to mention what I'd actually seen. While I waited for them to arrive, I huddled in the corner of my studio, jumping at every little sound. The police searched the entire property, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone but me had been there. They were sympathetic, but clearly thought I was just an exhausted artist whose imagination had run wild. I couldn't really blame them. After they left, I was too scared to stay in the studio. I locked up and went into the main house, leaving all the lights on. Sleep was out of the question. I just sat on the couch, staring at the walls until dawn broke. In the light of day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the light combined with my tired mind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen and felt was real. I avoided the studio for days after that, too unsettled to even think about painting. When I finally worked up the courage to go back in, everything looked normal. My spilled supplies were still scattered across the floor where I'd left them, but the air felt different somehow, heavier. As I cleaned up the mess, my eyes kept darting to that doorway. I couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment that dark figure might reappear. It never did, but the memory of it haunted me. I started taking precautions, installing extra locks, setting up security cameras, leaving lights on at all times. But none of it made me feel truly safe. That sense of being watched never fully went away. Sometimes when I'm working late, I still get that prickling feeling on the back of my neck, I've tried to talk to friends about what happened, but they all react with skepticism. I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm losing it. So I've stopped bringing it up. But the experience changed me. I find myself constantly on edge, always looking over my shoulder. My art has changed too. My once vibrant paintings have taken on darker tones, filled with shadowy figures and oppressive atmospheres. I can't seem to create anything else now. It's like that encounter opened up some dark channel in my mind that I can't close. I've researched extensively, trying to find some explanation for what I saw. I've read about shadow people, interdimensional beings, all sorts of paranormal phenomena, but nothing quite fits what I experienced. The not knowing is almost worse than the encounter itself. Some nights, when I'm alone in my studio, I find myself talking out loud, asking questions to the empty air, hoping for some kind of response. Part of me is terrified that something might actually answer, but another part desperately wants to understand what happened to me. I've considered selling the house, moving my studio somewhere else, but I'm afraid that whatever I encountered that night might follow me, and at least here, I know what to expect. The devil you know, right? So I stay and I paint, and I try to come to terms with the fact that my reality isn't what I thought it was. There are things out there beyond our understanding, lurking just at the edges of our perception. I caught a glimpse of that other world, and now I can never unsee it. I don't know if I'll ever have another encounter like that night. Part of me hopes I do, just so I can prove to myself that I'm not crazy. But mostly, I live in fear of seeing that dark figure again, because this time, it might not just stand in the doorway and watch. This time, it might come in. For now, all I can do is keep working, keep creating, and try to process my experience through my art. Maybe someday I'll find answers, or maybe I'll spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows, always wondering what's lurking just out of sight. Either way, I know I'll never forget that night in my studio when the impossible became real and my whole world changed in an instant. The first week was bliss. I spent my days unpacking and exploring the area, reveling in the fresh air and slower pace. My next-door neighbor, Mr. Johnson, seemed nice enough at first. He was an older gentleman, probably in his 70s, who lived alone in a well-kept ranch house. He brought over a pie to welcome me, and we chatted briefly. Something about his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, but I brushed it off as my city paranoia. It wasn't until about 2 weeks in that things started to feel off. I began hearing strange noises coming from Mr. Johnson's property late at night. At first, I thought it was just creaky old house sounds amplified in the quiet countryside. But the noises grew more frequent and unsettling. Thumps, scrapes, and what sounded like muffled voices. One night, I was woken up around 3 a.m. by a particularly loud crash. Groggy and annoyed, I went to the window to see what was going on. The full moon illuminated Mr. Johnson's backyard, and I saw him dragging something large and heavy across the grass. My blood ran cold when I realized it looked like it could be a body wrapped in plastic. He disappeared behind his tool shed for a few minutes, then came back empty-handed. I told myself I must have been seeing things in my sleep-addled state. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he was just moving some old furniture or equipment, but a seed of unease had been planted. Over the next few days, I found myself watching Mr. Johnson's house more closely. His routines seemed normal enough, puttering in the garden, driving to town for groceries. But sometimes I'd catch him staring at me from his window with an unnerving intensity. The final straw came about a week later. I was doing some yard work when a horrid stench hit me. It was coming from the direction of Mr. Johnson's property, a sickly, sweet odor of decay that made my stomach churn. I noticed a patch of freshly turned earth behind his shed, right where I'd seen him dragging that mysterious bundle. My mind was reeling. Could my kindly old neighbor really be hiding such a dark secret? I debated calling the police, but I had no real evidence, just strange noises and a bad feeling. I knew I needed to investigate further before making such a serious accusation. That night, I waited until Mr. Johnson's lights went out around 10 p.m. Heart pounding, I crept over to his yard and made my way to the disturbed patch of earth behind the shed. The smell was even worse up close. With shaking hands, I started to dig. I'd only gone about a foot down when my shovel hit something solid. Scraping away more dirt revealed a corner of what looked like a large plastic storage container. My breath caught in my throat. What horrors would I find inside? Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I let out a strangled yell and whirled around to find Mr. Johnson looming over me, his face twisted in anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled. I stammered out some excuse about looking for a lost dog toy, but he clearly wasn't buying it. Before I could react, he pulled out a rag and pressed it over my nose and mouth. A sickly, sweet smell filled my senses, and the world went dark. I came to slowly, my head pounding. As consciousness returned, panic set in as I realized I couldn't move. I was bound tightly to a chair in what looked like a basement. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb, revealing concrete walls covered in dark stains I didn't want to think about. Mr. Johnson was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear movement above me, footsteps pacing back and forth, cabinets opening and closing. I struggled against my bonds, but they were secure. Tears of fear and frustration welled up in my eyes. How could this be happening? Hours passed, though it was impossible to tell exactly how long in that windowless room. My arms ached from being restrained and my throat was parched. Just as despair was starting to set in, I heard a voice, faint but clear. Hey you, can you hear me?" I looked around wildly, but saw no one. "Who's there?" I croaked. "Over here in the corner," the voice replied. I squinted into the shadows and just barely made out the outline of a figure huddled in the far corner of the room. "Who are you? What is this place?" I asked desperately. "My name's Tom. I've been trapped down here for I don't even know how long anymore. That sick bastard upstairs, he does things to people, terrible things." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of things?" Tom's voice shook as he replied, "Trust me, you don't want to know. But listen, we don't have much time. He'll be coming back soon. You need to get out of here." "How? I'm tied up." "There's a nail sticking out of the floor by your left foot. If you can maneuver your chair over there, you might be able to saw through the ropes." It took what felt like an eternity, but I finally managed to scoot the heavy chair over to the nail. Contorting my body painfully, I was able to start working on the ropes binding my hands. The rough metal bit into my skin, but I hardly noticed through the adrenaline coursing through me. Just as the last rope snapped, I heard the basement door creak open. Footsteps began descending the stairs. "He's coming," Tom hissed. "Quick, hide." I dove behind some old boxes, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Mr. Johnson's weathered work boots came into view as he reached the bottom of the stairs. He walked over to where I had been tied up and let out a bellow of rage when he saw the empty chair. As he whirled around searching for me, I made a mad dash for the stairs. He lunged for me, but I managed to dodge his grasp. I took the stairs two at a time, Mr. Johnson's angry shouts echoing behind me. I burst out of the basement door into his kitchen. Disoriented, I frantically looked for the exit. I could hear him pounding up the stairs after me. Finally spotting the front door, I sprinted towards freedom. Just as my hand closed around the doorknob, I felt Mr. Johnson's fingers brush the back of my shirt. With a surge of desperate strength, I yanked the door open and tumbled out onto the front lawn. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I reached the local police station, gasping for air and probably looking like a madman. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements and leading officers back to Mr. Johnson's house. But when we arrived, the place was empty. No sign of Mr. Johnson, no evidence in the basement, not even the patch of disturbed earth in the backyard. The police did a thorough search, but came up empty-handed. They clearly thought I was either crazy or playing some kind of twisted prank. I insisted they check for the man in the basement, Tom, but they found no trace of anyone being held captive there. It's been months now, and I still have no answers. Mr. Johnson's house sits empty, a for sale sign swaying in the front yard. I've gone over that night 1,000 times in my head, wondering if I imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Sometimes late at night, I swear I can still hear that voice, Tom's voice, warning me to escape. And I wonder how many others weren't so lucky. I had just moved to the small town of Millbrook a few weeks ago for a new job opportunity. It was a quaint place, with charming old buildings and friendly locals who always seemed eager to chat. But there was something eerie about it, too, an undercurrent of unease I couldn't quite put my finger on. One crisp autumn afternoon, I decided to take a walk and explore more of the town. My wanderings led me to the outskirts, where I came across an old wrought-iron gate. Beyond it lay a sprawling cemetery, its weathered headstones peeking out from overgrown grass and gnarled trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air felt different as soon as I passed through the gate, colder somehow, and thick with an unsettling stillness. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way along the winding path. I spent some time examining the ornate monuments and reading the faded inscriptions, many dating back to the 1800s. It was fascinating to see the town's history laid out before me, generations of families resting side by side. As I rounded a bend in the path, I spotted an elderly man raking leaves near a cluster of graves. He wore faded overalls and a worn cap, his wrinkled face etched with deep lines. I assumed he must be the groundskeeper. "Afternoon," I called out with a friendly wave. "Hope you don't mind me looking around. I'm new in town and just exploring a bit." The old man looked up, fixing me with a piercing stare. His pale blue eyes seemed to look right through me. "Newcomers ain't usually welcome round these parts," he said gruffly. I was taken aback by his hostile tone. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I can leave if—" "Nah, you're here now," he cut me off. "Might as well show you around proper." He beckoned for me to follow him deeper into the cemetery. Against my better judgment, I did. As we walked, he began pointing out various graves and monuments, sharing bits of local history. That there's Old Man Jenkins, mean old cuss he was. Some say his ghost still haunts these grounds, looking to settle old scores. I chuckled nervously. Ghost stories, huh? I'm sure there are lots of those in a place like this. The groundskeeper's eyes narrowed. "You calling me a liar, boy?" No, of course not," I stammered. "I just meant, you city folk, always thinking you know better," he spat. "But you don't know nothing about this place, the secrets it holds." His demeanor was growing more agitated by the second. I started to feel distinctly uneasy, regretting my decision to follow this strange old man. We had ventured quite far from the entrance now, surrounded by dense woods and crumbling mausoleums. "Listen, I should probably be heading back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thanks for the tour, but—" In a move shockingly quick for his age, the groundskeeper lunged forward and grabbed my arm. His grip was like iron, bony fingers digging painfully into my flesh. "You ain't going nowhere," he snarled, his face contorting with rage. "Not till you've learned some respect for the dead." I wrenched my arm free and stumbled backward, heart pounding. The old man advanced on me, brandishing his rake like a weapon. "What the hell?" I cried out. "Stay back!" But he kept coming, swinging the rake wildly. I ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the rusted metal tines. Panic flooded my system as I realized how isolated we were. No one would hear me if I called for help. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face and thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the old man crashing through the woods behind me, unnaturally fast and agile. "You can't escape," his voice echoed through the trees. "This place has claimed you now." Terror lent me speed as I sprinted blindly through the forest. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. The sounds of pursuit seemed to come from all around me, as if the whole forest had come alive with malevolent intent. I lost all sense of direction, focused only on putting as much distance as possible between myself and my crazed attacker. Branches tore at my skin and roots threatened to trip me with every step. The light was fading fast, shadows deepening ominously around me. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through the tree line onto a road. A car was approaching, and I frantically waved it down, gasping for air. The driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down her window with a concerned look. "Are you all right, hun? You look like you've seen a ghost." I glanced back at the dark woods, half expecting to see the old groundskeeper emerge. But there was nothing, just the whisper of wind through the leaves. I got lost in the woods," I managed to say between ragged breaths. "Can you give me a ride back to town?" She kindly agreed, and as we drove, I tried to calm my racing heart. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. Back in town, I went straight to the police station to report what had happened. The officer on duty listened patiently to my wild tale, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Look, son, I know Millbrook can seem a bit strange to newcomers," he said, "but I can assure you, old Jim's been tending that cemetery for 40 years. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "But he attacked me," I insisted. "He chased me through the woods." The officer sighed. "Jim's pushing 90 years old. There's no way he could have chased you anywhere. Are you sure you didn't just get spooked and imagine things? Those woods can play tricks on your mind, especially as it's getting dark." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean 90 years old? The man I saw couldn't have been more than 70. Now the officer was looking at me with real concern. "Son, maybe you should get checked out at the hospital. Could be you took a fall out there, hit your head or something." But I knew what I had seen and experienced. The terror had been all too real. Yet as the days passed, I started to doubt myself. Had it all been some kind of hallucination? A vivid waking nightmare? I avoided the cemetery after that, taking the long way around whenever I had to go to that part of town. But sometimes late at night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those ice-blue eyes boring into me, and I'd wonder, what really happened that day in the woods? What secrets did that old cemetery hold? The truth is, I'll probably never know. But one thing's for certain, I'll never set foot in that place again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. because once you glimpse what lies beyond, there's no going back. The veil between worlds is thinner than we think, and in places like that old cemetery, it's all too easy to slip through to the other side. Me and my friends Jake, Emily, and Tyler were hanging out at the mall, trying to beat the heat and kill some time. We were all 16 or 17, that awkward age where you're not quite an adult but desperate to prove you're not a kid anymore. As we window shopped and sipped our smoothies, Jake mentioned he'd heard about an old abandoned carnival on the outskirts of town. "We should totally check it out," he said with a mischievous grin. "Could be cool to explore, maybe get some creepy photos for Instagram." I was hesitant at first. Trespassing wasn't really my thing, and abandoned places gave me the creeps. But peer pressure got the best of me, and soon we were piling into Jake's beat-up Corolla and heading out of town. The drive took about 30 minutes, mostly down winding back roads. As we got further from civilization, an uneasy feeling started to grow in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, not wanting to seem like a chicken in front of my friends. Finally, we rounded a bend and saw it, the rusted gates of the old carnival looming before us, half hidden by overgrown weeds. Jake parked on the shoulder and we all got out, staring at the eerie sight. "Whoa," Emily whispered. "This is way creepier than I expected." Tyler was already heading for the gate. "Come on, guys, let's check it out." We squeezed through a gap in the fence and found ourselves standing in what used to be the main midway. Decaying food stands and ticket booths lined the cracked pavement. Faded, peeling murals of clowns and acrobats grinned down at us. The silence was oppressive. No birds chirping, no wind rustling the leaves, just dead quiet. As we ventured further in, my skin started to crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Emily snapped some pictures on her phone while Jake and Tyler joked around, pretending to be carnival barkers. I lagged behind, jumping at every little noise. We came to the old Ferris wheel, its carriages hanging at odd angles and squeaking softly in the breeze. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. I whirled around, heart pounding. "Guys," I hissed, "I think someone's here." They turned to look at me, confused. Then we all heard it, more footsteps, coming from multiple directions. Emerging from behind rides and booths were about a dozen boys, maybe 18 or 19 years old. They wore ratty clothes and had a mean, hungry look in their eyes that made my blood run cold. "Well, well," drawled one of them, a tall guy with greasy black hair. "What do we have here?" Some fresh meat wandered into our territory. We instinctively huddled together as they surrounded us. I could smell the reek of alcohol and body odor. Emily let out a frightened whimper. "We don't want any trouble," Jake said, trying to sound brave, but his voice shook. "We're just leaving, okay?" The leader laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, you're not going anywhere, not until we've had some fun." They started to close in, leering and making crude comments. I've never felt fear like that before, pure primal terror. My legs felt like jelly and I couldn't breathe. This was really happening. We were trapped. Just as the first guy reached out to grab Emily's arm, a booming voice cut through the air. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" We all turned to see a group of adults marching towards us, 3 men and 2 women, all in their 40s or 50s. They looked furious. "Get away from those kids right now," one of the women yelled. To my amazement, the gang of boys actually looked scared. They backed off, muttering curses. "This ain't over," the leader snarled at us before they all took off running. I nearly collapsed with relief as the adults reached us. They introduced themselves as a group of urban explorers who liked to photograph abandoned places. "Are you kids all right?" one of the men asked, putting a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Those punks didn't hurt you, did they?" We assured them we were okay, just badly shaken up. They insisted on escorting us back to our car. As we walked, they explained that gang of boys was known to hang out here and harass people. "You're lucky we showed up when we did," one of the women said grimly. "Those boys are bad news. They've hurt people before." When we reached Jake's car, they made sure we all got in safely. "Go straight home and don't come back here," they warned us. "This place isn't safe." We didn't need to be told twice. Jake peeled out of there like a bat out of hell. We were all silent on the drive home, still processing what had happened. To this day, I still get chills thinking about how close we came to real danger that afternoon. If those adults hadn't shown up when they did, I don't even want to imagine what might have happened. I've never gone back to that carnival, and I hope I never will. But sometimes I still have nightmares about those leering faces closing in around us. I don't think I'll ever forget the sheer terror of that moment when I realized we were trapped. It was a harsh lesson in how quickly an innocent adventure can turn dangerous. We were just dumb kids looking for a thrill, but we could have paid a terrible price for our stupidity. I'm eternally grateful to those strangers who saved us that day. Now, whenever my friends suggest exploring abandoned places, I shut that idea down immediately. Some thrills just aren't worth the risk. That old carnival may be abandoned, but it's far from empty. And the memories of what almost happened there will haunt me for the rest of my life. I never thought it would happen to me. You hear about these things on the news, but you always think, that's terrible, but it could never happen to us. Until it does. It was just a normal Saturday afternoon. My son Jake, who had just turned 6, was playing in the front yard while I was inside doing some cleaning. I could see him through the window, riding his bike up and down the sidewalk like he'd done 100 times before. I'd peek out every few minutes to check on him, feeling totally at ease in our quiet suburban neighborhood. Around 3 p.m., I glanced out and didn't see Jake. I figured he'd just ridden around the corner or something, so I opened the front door and called his name. No response. I walked out to the street and looked both ways, calling louder. Still nothing. A knot started forming in my stomach. I jogged up and down the block, looking in all the usual spots. The neighbor's yard where he liked to play with their dog, the little wooded area at the end of the street. Panic was rising in my chest as I ran back home, hoping against hope that he'd somehow slipped back inside without me noticing. The house was empty. Jake's bike was still on the front lawn where he'd left it. I called my husband Mark in a frenzy, barely able to choke out the words. "Jake's gone. I can't find him anywhere." Mark rushed home from work while I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly dial the number. The next few hours passed in a blur. Police swarmed our street. Neighbors came out to help search. I answered what felt like a million questions, describing Jake and what he was wearing over and over. Had I seen any strange vehicles? Any unfamiliar people in the area? No. Everything had seemed totally normal until he vanished into thin air. As night fell, the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Where was my little boy? Was he cold, scared, hurt? The possibilities racing through my mind were too horrible to contemplate. Mark and I clung to each other, neither of us able to voice our worst fears. I couldn't eat or sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face, his big brown eyes, his goofy smile with the missing front tooth, the way his hair always stuck up in the back, no matter how much I tried to smooth it down. I tortured myself, thinking of all the times I'd been impatient with him, all the moments I'd taken for granted. I would have given anything to go back in time and hold him close, to tell him how much I loved him. The police set up a command center in our living room. Our faces were all over the local news. Jake's picture was plastered everywhere. Missing child in big red letters that made my heart clench every time I saw them. Each hour that passed felt like an eternity. On day 3, I was sitting on the couch in a daze when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I answered with shaking hands. "Mom?" It was Jake's voice, small and scared. I nearly collapsed with relief. "Jake, baby, where are you? Are you okay?" "I don't know where I am," he said, his voice wobbling. "There's a gas station. The sign says Oakwood." I relayed the information to the police officers in the room, who immediately sprang into action. Oakwood was a small town about 30 miles away. "It's okay, sweetheart," I told Jake, trying to keep my voice steady. "The police are coming to get you. Can you stay where you are?" "Okay," he said. "Mom, I'm scared. I want to come home." "I know, baby. You'll be home soon. I love you so much." The wait for news was agonizing. Finally, after what felt like hours, we got word that Jake had been found safe at the gas station. Mark and I raced to the police station to meet him. When I saw Jake, looking small and tired but blessedly alive and whole, I burst into tears. I scooped him up in my arms and held him so tightly, breathing in his familiar scent. He clung to me, burying his face in my neck. Over the next few days, we tried to piece together what had happened. Jake's memories were fuzzy and confused. He said a man in a blue car had offered him candy and asked for help finding his lost puppy. Jake knew he wasn't supposed to go with strangers, but the man had seemed nice. He described being taken to a house where he was kept in a dark room. There was another kid there, too, a girl a little older than Jake. She helped him escape when the man was sleeping. They ran until they found the gas station, where the girl told Jake to call home and then disappeared. The police searched for the girl and the kidnapper, but found no trace of either. It was like they'd vanished into thin air, just as Jake had 3 days earlier. The house Jake described couldn't be located. In the weeks and months that followed, we tried to settle back into normal life. But things would never be quite the same. Jake had nightmares and was afraid to play outside alone. I found myself constantly on edge, unable to let him out of my sight for more than a few minutes without panicking. We went to therapy, installed security cameras, got a dog. Slowly, things improved. Jake started smiling and laughing again. He made new friends at school. But I'll never forget those 3 days of hell or stop wondering about the mysterious girl who saved my son. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, reaching for Jake in a panic before I remember he's safe in his bed down the hall. I tiptoe to his room and watch him sleep, marveling at how peaceful he looks. In those quiet moments, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude that our story had a happy ending when so many others don't. I know we can never go back to the carefree life we had before. The world feels more dangerous now, the shadows deeper and darker. But we survived. We're together. And I'll never again take for granted the simple joy of hugging my child and knowing he's safe in my arms. There were 5 of us that day, me, Jake, Lizzie, Marcus, and Olivia. We'd known each other since high school and were always up for an adventure together. We packed some basic supplies, flashlights, water, snacks, and headed out early one Saturday morning in Jake's beat-up pickup truck. The drive took about an hour, winding through increasingly rural back roads until we reached the turnoff for the mine. It was barely more than an overgrown dirt path at that point. Jake had to creep along at a snail's pace to avoid bottoming out the truck. Finally, we reached a small clearing where the path ended. The entrance to the mine loomed before us, a dark, gaping maw in the hillside, half obscured by vegetation. Rusty old equipment and collapsed wooden structures littered the area. The whole place had an eerie, abandoned feel that sent a shiver down my spine. "Well, here we are, guys," Jake said with a grin, killing the engine. "Ready to do some exploring?" We grabbed our backpacks and gathered at the mine entrance. Up close it looked even more forbidding, a pitch-black void that seemed to swallow all light. The air flowing out was damp and musty. "Maybe we should rethink this," Olivia said nervously. "It doesn't look very stable." "Oh, come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Marcus teased. "We didn't come all this way just to chicken out now." After a bit more playful ribbing, we all switched on our flashlights and stepped into the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, and the beam of my light seemed pitifully small against the vast blackness. Our footsteps and voices echoed strangely off the rough stone walls. For the first 15 minutes or so, it was actually kind of fun. We joked around, daring each other to go down spooky side passages or making up stories about the mine's history. But as we ventured deeper, an unsettling feeling started to creep over me. The passages twisted and branched in bewildering ways. It would be all too easy to get lost down here. "Hey guys, maybe we should start heading back soon," I suggested. "I'm not sure I like how deep we're getting." "Aw, don't be such a baby," Jake laughed. "We've barely even started exploring." But I could tell the others were getting a bit on edge too. Lizzie kept glancing nervously over her shoulder, and even Marcus had stopped cracking jokes. That's when we heard it, a faint scrabbling sound, like claws on stone, echoing from somewhere up ahead. We all froze. "What was that?" Olivia whispered. "Probably just some rats or something," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. We stood silently for a moment, straining to hear. Just as I was about to suggest we turn back, the sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably the sound of footsteps. Heavy, shuffling footsteps. Panic shot through me like an electric current. "We need to go. Now," I hissed. No one argued this time. We turned and started hurrying back the way we came. But in our haste and fear, we must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The passages all looked the same in the dim light of our flashlights. "Guys, I don't recognize this," Lizzie said, her voice trembling. "I think we're lost." Before anyone could respond, an inhuman howl echoed through the tunnels, raising the hair on the back of my neck. It sounded close, too close. "Run!" Jake yelled. We took off at a sprint, our lights bobbing crazily as we ran. I could hear ragged breathing and pounding footsteps behind us, getting closer by the second. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, but terror kept me going. Rounding a corner, my light fell on a figure shambling towards us from a side tunnel. I caught a glimpse of twisted limbs, patchy fur, and glowing yellow eyes before I screamed and veered away. "This way," Marcus shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me down another passage. We ran blindly, taking turn after turn, with no idea if we were heading deeper into the mine or towards the exit. The thing pursuing us let out another bone-chilling howl, the sound bouncing crazily off the walls until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Suddenly, Olivia stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the ground and going out. "My ankle!" she cried. "I think I twisted it." Jake and I each grabbed one of her arms, half carrying her as we continued to flee. I could hear the creature's labored breathing now so close behind us. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I felt a cool breeze on my face. "The exit!" Lizzie shouted. "I can see daylight!" With a final burst of desperate energy, we sprinted for the mine entrance. We exploded out into the sunlight, stumbling and gasping for air. Jake and Marcus immediately started pushing one of the big rusty pieces of equipment in front of the entrance. We all stood there, panting and staring at the blocked entrance, waiting to see if the thing would emerge. But after several tense minutes, all remained quiet. The drive home was silent, all of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd experienced. To this day, I'm not sure what that thing in the mine was. Some kind of mutant, a forgotten experiment, or something else entirely. But the memory of those glowing eyes and that inhuman howl still haunts my nightmares. We never went back to that mine, and we never spoke about what happened to anyone else. Who would believe us anyway? But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I wonder, is that thing still down there in the darkness, waiting for its next victims to wander in? I was so excited for a relaxing weekend getaway at our remote cabin. My husband John had to go on a last-minute business trip, but I decided to head up there anyway for some much-needed alone time. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I arrived Friday afternoon and spent the day unpacking, reading, and enjoying the peaceful solitude. As night fell, I made myself a simple dinner and curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and a good book. The cabin was cozy, lit by the warm glow of lamps and the crackling fireplace. Outside, crickets chirped and a light breeze rustled through the trees. It was exactly the tranquil escape I had been craving. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I was just drifting off to sleep when a sudden noise jolted me awake. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. My heart started racing as I sat up and strained my ears. The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I held my breath, desperately hoping I had imagined it. But a moment later, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the grass around the side of the cabin. Panic gripped me as I realized someone was out there, circling the cabin in the darkness. I quietly slipped out of bed and crept to the window, peeking out through a crack in the curtains. The night was pitch black. I couldn't see anything beyond the small circle of light from the porch lamp. As my eyes adjusted, I thought I saw a shadow move across the yard, but it was gone in an instant. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my cell phone to call for help. To my horror, there was no signal. Of course, we were miles from the nearest cell tower. The landline. I rushed to the kitchen, fumbling in the dark, but when I picked up the receiver, the line was dead. How was that possible? It had been working fine earlier. A floorboard creaked outside the kitchen window and I gasped, dropping the phone. Someone was right outside. I could hear their ragged breathing. Panic threatened to overwhelm me as I realized how utterly alone and vulnerable I was. Miles from help, no way to call anyone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. What would John do? The gun. John kept a handgun locked in the bedroom closet for protection. With trembling hands, I retrieved the small safe and entered the combination. I loaded the gun with shaking fingers, praying I wouldn't have to use it. For the next several hours, I moved silently through the cabin, gun clutched tightly. Every creak and groan of the old wooden structure made me flinch. Occasionally, I heard movement outside, leaves rustling, twigs snapping. Once I could have sworn I saw a face peering in through a window, but it vanished as soon as I looked directly at it. I was terrified to turn on any lights, afraid of making myself an easier target. So I sat in the darkness, jumping at every sound, my finger tense on the trigger. My mind raced with horrible scenarios. Who was out there? What did they want? How many of them were there? Around 3 a.m., the sounds outside seemed to intensify. Footsteps circled the cabin more rapidly. I heard a scraping noise at the back door, like someone trying to pick the lock. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Then suddenly, everything went silent. The abrupt quiet was almost more unnerving than the noises had been. I didn't dare move a muscle, straining my ears for any sound. But there was nothing, not even crickets or wind. An unnatural, eerie stillness had fallen over everything. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Gradually, the faintest hint of pre-dawn light began to creep through the windows. As the sky slowly brightened, birds started chirping, and the normal sounds of the forest returned. When full daylight finally arrived, I cautiously peeked out the windows. Everything looked normal. No signs of disturbance or intruders. Still clutching the gun, I did a careful sweep of every room in the cabin. Nothing was out of place. With shaking legs, I stepped outside. The gravel driveway was unmarked. The grass showed no signs of being trampled. I circled the entire cabin and found no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, exhausted and confused. Had I imagined the whole thing? The terror had felt so real. But there was no evidence that anyone had actually been there. When John arrived home that afternoon, he found me still on edge, dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep. I poured out the whole story. To his credit, he took me seriously and called the local police to come check things out. The officers did a thorough search of the property, but found nothing suspicious. No signs of attempted break-in, no unusual tracks or evidence in the surrounding woods. They were kind, but I could tell they thought I had simply let my imagination run wild alone in an unfamiliar place. John was concerned and supportive, but I could sense his skepticism too. He gently suggested that maybe the unfamiliar nighttime sounds of the forest had spooked me, or that I had dozed off while reading and had an extremely vivid nightmare. I wanted to believe that was true. The alternative, that something inexplicable and terrifying had actually happened, was too disturbing to contemplate. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. The visceral fear, the sounds, the shadows. It wasn't something I could have imagined. We ended up cutting our trip short and heading home early. I just couldn't shake the feeling of unease. John suggested we sell the cabin, but I refused. I didn't want this bizarre experience to rob us of a place we loved. But I made him promise we would always come up together from now on. In the weeks and months that followed, I replayed that night over and over, trying to make sense of it. I researched local legends and history, looked into any unusual crime in the area, but found nothing that could explain what happened. To this day, I still don't know what to make of that night. Was it some kind of mass hallucination brought on by isolation? A vivid waking nightmare? Or was there really something out there, circling our cabin with unknown intentions? I may never know the truth, but one thing's for certain. I'll never forget the sheer terror of those long, dark hours alone in the woods, and the inexplicable mystery of what happened that night at the cabin.